Cárcel Escalante is the heir to one of the empire's greatest families. Born with an appearance blessed by God, he had a brilliant future ahead. But ironically, his future crumbled at age 6 when a 6-year-old girl pointed her finger at him and announced in front of all the empire's nobles that he would be her fiancé, solely because he had a beautiful face. Since then, Carcel tried to break this engagement by any means, as he didn't want to marry a woman who dresses like a nun and live the rest of his life like a monk. He joined the army to delay the wedding, sent letters for the girl to reconsider her decision, and even slept with other women of the empire. But all his efforts were in vain because, from the beginning, he was doing exactly what she wanted him to do. Hello, I am Jaira, and it is a pleasure to accompany you in another fascinating story. Anyway, without further ado, let's get to the story. It all started on that day when a 6-year-old girl pointed her finger at him with that lifeless gaze. It was on this day that his life began to fall apart. She thought all noble families were the same, so the only thing that caught her attention was his face. Her name was Inés de Pérez. She belonged to one of the highest families of the Grandes of Ortega, an alliance of 17 noble families to whom the emperor had granted titles of nobility. This girl was the only daughter of the Duke of Valestena, who had rejected both the Prince of the Empire and the highly revered and intelligent position of Crown Princess. She could have chosen any of the many suitors, but her choice fell upon the heir of Escalante for the sole reason that he was the most handsome. The only thing she said afterward was that he must never forget that she likes him. Now, 17 years later, at a military base, the sound of footsteps was accompanied by the screams of a noblewoman calling for Lord Carcel. He stopped for a moment and, turning around, listened to the woman's plea for help, explaining that the Countess is complaining of extreme vertigo. The girl's cheeks flushed, and she couldn't look at him directly, but she continued speaking, saying she didn't know what to do since there were only weak women in this place. While Carcel adjusted his gloves, the woman judged that the Countess is just feeling a simple dizziness, which had happened before, but she should be fine if she rests for a bit in a quiet place. However, her residence is on the outskirts of Mendoza. Suddenly, Lord Carcel smiled slightly and observed her silently. He was the son of the greatest noble family of Ortega and also the most attractive man in Mendoza. His majestic presence left the woman visibly nervous, to the point of shivering. But suddenly she woke from her trance upon hearing Carcel call her. Awkwardly, she tried to resume her speech, explaining that they were waiting for a night to pass so they could ask for help, but not a single soul passed in the time they spent waiting here. So they are relieved that he has appeared. In the background, other women watch the scene with looks of expectation, whispering discreetly among themselves. Then Carcel traced a slight smile and said that indeed this seems like something urgent. The Countess, whom Carcel carried in his arms, commented that she heard his grandfather had dedicated his life to the service of Ortega and that he decided to follow in the same footsteps. Still, she was very surprised to hear this news the first time. After all, he is the heir of the Escalante family, and the Black Sea is still a dangerous place where battles frequently occur. The victory of his grandfather, Admiral Calderon, was enough to bring a brief moment of peace, but pirates still caused many problems every year. Being a member of the Grandes of Ortega, Carcel responds that he learned his powers come with great responsibilities. His grandfather always told him that to maintain a position of honor, it was necessary to be prepared to accept the greatest of responsibilities. But at that moment, the Countess threw herself at him with a kiss, catching him by surprise and interrupting him. Among the 17 noble families that had been graced with titles of nobility from the imperial family of Ortega, the Escalante family was considered one of the greatest. And as the heir of this powerful family, Cárcel Escalante was a man whose incredible appearance was the envy of everyone. It was as if he were truly blessed by God. At age 15, Carcel already spent his time in the company of all the women who had reached adulthood. By age 17, he was followed by admirers everywhere he went. For years, he familiarized himself with more mature women, and from a distance, he was always extremely insatiable even in his youth. Now, in the peak of his life, he noticed the Countess's breasts and, staring fixably at that specific area, Carcel reflected that he didn't enlist in the army for this. Now, she asks if he wonders why he enlisted after all. While she kissed him, the Countess said that woman, his fiancée, is very simple. She is not good enough for him. Of course, she comes from the best family in the empire since she belongs to House Valestena, but she always has that tired and disinterested look on her face. The Countess didn't understand how she could act that way when she has a fiancé as perfect as him. In that instant, Carcel noticed that his fiancée, Inés Valestena, was standing in front of them, watching silently. Meanwhile, the Countess, drowning in Carcel's arms, continued to speak, saying it's unbelievable, but she dresses as if she were a nun. After 17 years of engagement, this was when Inés Valestena learned for the first time of his infidelity. Carcel had heard people comment many times about her clothes, that his fiancée dresses like a nun, even at an imperial banquet. Furthermore, she behaved far too arrogantly in front of the other noble ladies. Even His Majesty sees this. In a carriage, Carcel headed toward the Duke of Valestena's residence. He is the type of person who quickly forgets unpleasant memories, but this is more of a version than a few hours later, the carriage arrived at the Valestena residence. As Carcel walked, he reflected that he had always lived with the conservative idea that after marriage one should have no woman other than his wife. But ironically, this became a vulgar motivation for him now. At the same time that he transformed marriage into a tomb, adultery is forbidden even after death. If that's the case, Carcel decided to have as much fun as he can before the wedding. That way, even if he lives the rest of his life like a monk, he will have no regrets, and all his scoundrel days will soon be in the past. Carcel burst into the room where Inés was, reflecting to himself that he has no other choice because now he was facing this strange feeling of guilt, a sort of ashamed feeling that he shouldn't have been caught by her. Inés looked coldly at him and greeted him with a soft tone of voice. He also greeted her while thinking that she is always in well-covered clothing with no openings up to the neck. She presumed he would like to see her in the last few days. He said that, in fact, he wanted to meet her not just yesterday, but also 3 days ago, as well as 2 weeks before. Inés explained that it was raining torrentially in recent days and that she didn't want him to be affected by coming here. Carcel thought it was an expected reaction, especially after the scene she witnessed, but he still blamed her for the fact that he would have to live the rest of his life like a monk. He said he knows how she must have felt that day. However, Inés pretended not to understand what he said and asked what exactly he is trying to say. He commented irritably that she knows exactly what he's talking about, but Inés said that she actually doesn't know. Carcel reflected that she had changed his life with a simple snap of her fingers, so calling her submissive would be nothing more than a complete joke. But he knew that Inés Valestena loved him. She had chosen him out of love, giving up her noble position and her rightful marriage to the imperial family. As a consequence, there were many opportunities for her to cancel and undo everything, but she discarded them completely. Whether it was 17 years ago or now, she is waiting for him out of love, in the very same place where she always was. But this had always been the problem. Inés Valestena loved him, but he doesn't like her. This caused him to spend years drowning in guilt because of it. Carcel wanted to explain everything, but before he could invent a decent excuse, Inés said she saw it with her own eyes, so she has all the explanations she needs, and by her understanding, there is no problem at all. This surprised him, making him ask immediately if she is being serious. When she said yes, Carcel began to lose confidence, commenting that he understands how unpleasant that must have been for her, so at least scream at him. However, Inés smiled briefly while saying she isn't even upset about it. She explained calmly that she didn't want to see him because of the rain, as she didn't want him arriving there soaked. And honestly speaking, she found this kind of discussion very tiring since they aren't even close enough to be having this conversation. She also said it's not as if he were involved with only 1 or 2 women either, and asked if he really thought she didn't know everything. Carcel questioned if she isn't angry. Inés responded by asking why she should be, as he is free to be with whoever he wants. He couldn't understand, after all, they were about to get married. But she made a point to explain gently that this doesn't mean he has to lose his freedom immediately, and besides, they aren't married yet. She narrowed her eyes and said that from now on, do what you want, don't worry about her, and there is no need for explanations. Carcel comments stunned that this isn't the least bit funny and asked how she can be so understanding of her fiancé's female troubles. Inés closed her eyes for a moment and said she isn't saying this just because she's very understanding. And upon opening her eyes again, she made it clear that she is saying he is free to do as he pleases because it means she doesn't care about him at all. Carcel's eyes widened and his heart began to beat frantically as he observed his fiancée, who, without showing any expression, asked coldly if he understood now. It was summer in Escalante when Carcel turned 23, and it was then she told him everything he believed was wrong. When he was little, Carcel didn't know what a lifetime meant, so he asked the people at the banquet how many years a lifetime is, which made everyone laugh strangely. Instead of answering, he became irritated until suddenly someone approached and asked if he even knows what those words mean. It was Inés. who continued saying that he probably doesn't know. Noticing him frowning, Cárcel became embarrassed and shouted that he does know. So she asked for an explanation, but he lowered his head and turned pale because he didn't know. Meanwhile, little Inés ran abruptly toward her father and asked if she really needs to talk to Lord Cárcel. Her father, Duke Leonel Valestena, warned that she already knows she is much smarter than children her age, but she shouldn't ignore those who aren't as clever as her. Cárcel, on the other hand, seemed to think they believed he was an idiot. Inés replied to her father that she doesn't need friends. Besides, Lord Cárcel is her fiancé, not her friend. The Duke sighed deeply, trying to put the idea in her head that she should be kinder to him, like a sweet and gentle young lady. However, she interrupted him, admitting that she has a bad personality but is still a lady. Cárcel shuddered in surprise when she finished scolding her father and turned her head sharply. She asked that Escalante listen carefully. She explained that only the dead can answer how long a life is. Cárcel would know if they were alive. She explained that the dead would know the moment they experienced death. She says that a lifespan is the amount of time someone has until they die. That is, life only ends when one dies. So if he thinks like that, she's sure he can do the math and figure out how much lifetime he has left. Cárcel sank into his world of thoughts, imagining how he would die, mentioning that his grandfather lost his leg after being shot in the Black Sea and asking if that meant he would also have to lose his leg like him or something. Inés murmured that his grandfather had lived more than a decade even after losing his leg. Now he was completely confused, asking if he will have to live with her until his legs are cut off. Suddenly, tears streamed down his red face as he shouted that if he doesn't do that, then he has to marry her. Everyone began to look at them, trying to understand what is happening, while Inés scared him even more by mentioning that they are going to do more than just marry. They are going to have a baby together, too. After a few seconds, Inés asked if he hates her, even though she already knew the answer. So he nodded slowly, confirming that yes. She smiled genuinely and said that, in fact, it might not last a lifetime. In that instant, Cárcel looked at her with frozen eyes and asked what she's talking about. With a reserved expression, Inés said she is talking about their marriage. But before Cárcel could ask how she knows, the Empress ordered everyone to raise their glasses to make a toast to Cárcel Escalante as a husband and to Inés Valestena de Pérez, who will marry as soon as they become adults. Cárcel is almost certain it started with that cursed toast. It was from that day on that his entire perfect life began to crumble. Someone still didn't understand why it was him. That someone was Oscar Lanza de Ortega, the crown prince and Cárcel's cousin. It seemed that to him, Cárcel had done something to Lady Inés, and he judged that perhaps it's because of his face. Oscar asked if he didn't know she was his. Cárcel replied that Inés never belonged to him, which left the prince furious, accusing him of stealing his master's property. However, he said he wouldn't punish him since he is his uncle's son, but his union with Inés was supposed to be for the sake of the imperial family. When Inés refused the crown prince's offer and chose Cárcel, it was Empress Cayetana who brought Cárcel before the girl, almost as if she were waiting for this moment. She didn't even question Inés for the insolence of refusing the emperor's son. On the contrary, as she gently asked Inés to make her own choice, the Empress might have needed to maintain an alliance with House Valestena, but she certainly didn't want that gloomy child. Although she needed Inés, she didn't believe the girl was worthy of her son. Oscar called Inés a stupid crow and commented that she refused him but chose an idiot like his cousin. Cárcel said he had thought he liked Inés since he wanted her before. The prince burst into laughter at Cárcel's words. He explained that wanting and liking are two different things. He wanted to marry her, but that didn't mean he loved her. It just so happened that among all the women he could marry, there was no one with a better lineage than her. Regardless, he warned Cárcel that they are going to pay a little visit to his crow fiancé because they have a long way to go before they become adults. When the meeting happened, Inés did not receive them well, but Oscar was full of energy and confident. In contrast, Cárcel was devastated. He murmured to himself that Inés seems to hate the crown prince completely. Oscar turned his head sharply and looked at him as if he had heard him from afar. Inés explained that it was custom to give at least a week's notice for a visit, but it seemed His Highness considered visiting her estate such an extraordinary convenience that he had ignored proper etiquette. As a result, they couldn't receive him as they should. The crown prince looked up, saying there was no need to prepare anything because he didn't come to see the duke or the duchess, but rather. However, Inés insisted on saying that this meeting would be better if she were prepared. He wanted to talk about the book she had recommended, mentioning that his love for books was a serious problem because sometimes he didn't have time to learn how to rule the empire. She replied that perhaps she shouldn't have recommended that book to him. Oscar, on the other hand, said that was nonsense because discussing these thought-provoking topics with her was always a pleasure. After all, the existence of intellectuals like them could be very lonely, as they constantly had to deal with the ignorance of the masses. The prince confessed that this is why whenever he sees her, he feels he can finally breathe. And turning to Cárcel, he said his naive fiancée still hasn't realized the pain people like them must endure. The crown prince told her it would be difficult for her to find someone who is her intellectual equal besides himself, then asked why she is throwing her life away. He said proudly that he will give the opportunity to correct her failed decision, and in the name of the Ortega imperial family, Oscar asked her to marry him. With those words, a deathly silence flowed. Then Inés broke this silence by saying coldly that she doesn't like him. Now with those words, Oscar was frozen, unable to believe he was refused so easily. But she didn't stop and said once more that she doesn't like him, so her answer is certainly no. The prince was dominated by accumulating rage, his fists clenched. Oscar wanted to know the reason, but suddenly she called Cárcel and asked why he isn't defending her since he is her fiancé. The crown prince didn't want his intervention, but Inés continued talking to Cárcel, mentioning that the crown prince is making her uncomfortable. Oscar, for his part, commented that this is no business for children, as the adults are talking now. Then Cárcel put his hands to his head, saying that Lady Inés is only 6 years old, when suddenly she hid behind her fiancé's back, which caused a violent reaction in both. Oscar commented that now he understood what game his cousin was playing and asked if he really intends to disrespect his master. Cárcel counter-argued that he doesn't want to play anything. Oscar wanted to believe she wasn't serious, but Inés had heard enough and told Cárcel to tell him that she doesn't want him. His Highness insisted, saying that all he needs is her by his side, and together they would rule Ortega. Inés ignored him, turning to Cárcel and saying this is giving her a terrible headache. However, Cárcel remained standing, reflecting on how long he has to suffer like this, how long he has to be trapped between these two, when suddenly Inés whispered that he is still a 6-year-old boy. So he doesn't have a master yet. Probably that was the impulse for him to take her hand and drag her out of the room. After running for a few meters, Inés said he can let go of her hand now. But when he asked if her headache had passed, she pulled her hand away and said that obviously she was lying. Cárcel couldn't believe she had no fear of death by lying to the crown prince. He had no idea why his cousin liked a girl like her. She was rude, she wasn't even pretty. However, observing her closely, he noticed that at least her eyes were pretty, and maybe she is a little cute, but even so, he thought he was too much for her. Inés took a damp cloth and called Escalante to clean his hands. He thought she would hand him the cloth, but what fell into his hand was Inés's hand holding the cloth, and she herself cleaning his hand. Cárcel became quite embarrassed. He turned as red as a tomato. 3 minutes later, he felt as if he had been treated like an idiot. Inés asked what was wrong. He replied that she didn't call him Escalante earlier. She said she thought he hated her since he kept crying about how he didn't want to marry her, so she doesn't call him by his first name. Cárcel begged her not to remind him of that, but he himself didn't understand the reason he was so embarrassed. So Inés agreed to call him by his first name. No one had ever treated Cárcel that way in his entire life. She is the only one who does that to him. On the other hand, he thought she was strange because people say she likes him, but if it were really true, she wouldn't treat him the way she treats him. Inés asked if it's strange that she likes him, but Cárcel responded by questioning if she really likes him. She admitted she wouldn't have decided to marry him if she didn't like him. Cárcel said people say she doesn't understand the great honor it is to marry the crown prince and only chose him because he has a beautiful face. However, she didn't deny that she chose him because of his face. She said she liked him, and yet she is being so rude. Cárcel wanted to know if she didn't want to impress him somehow. Inés asked if he is saying she should want to impress him. He demanded that if she wants him to like her too, then she should at least try. But she said firmly that that's where he is mistaken. He doesn't have to like her. She doesn't need him to like her. The only thing he needs to remember is that she likes him very much. Back to the present, Cárcel knew something was wrong. From that moment on, he wondered if her feelings for him had really changed, but reflected that she was always quite shy, so she only expressed her affections through letters. But her devotion to him was already known by all of high society. Even that room was still the same. Nothing had changed in all those years. But there was something there, and Carcel was convinced that this could explain the change in her feelings. Approaching with slow steps and acting so cold and precise, Inés asked what Escalante is doing here. He thought before answering that at least she had stopped calling him Lord as she had done last time. But he knew one thing in this room definitely changed. Even in that dress suitable only for a funeral, there is no way to hide the fact that her body matured beautifully. Carcel asked why she wasn't interested in him. She replied that there was no hidden motive, so he doesn't need to worry about that. Clearly that wasn't the best answer, so Inés began to explain. She says she had only said that to make him feel better. She said she knew about all his escapades, so he doesn't have to worry about what she will think. He is free to do as he pleases, and asked what part of that he didn't understand. Carcel said everything makes sense now. He had upset her, and that's why his fiancée was being so sarcastic. Although she had no idea what Carcel was talking about, he tried to explain that either this was the case or she had said those words without putting any meaning in them, and sighed before saying he is acting as if she had found another man or something. Carcel asked if that was the case, but the answer he received was her asking if that is important. Inés explained that she is a loner that nobody wants. It's like his cousin once said, she is the crow of House Valestena. However, Carcel said the reason men aren't after her is because she already has an extremely handsome fiancé, but it's no surprise she isn't noticed since she always dresses like a nun. In a sea of vibrant birds, she stands out like a black crow. Carcel thought that with that body, she could even conquer the stupidest of nobles. But as much as it's true, he couldn't simply say she was beautiful just because of her body, as he would seem like a pervert. And he explained that women were interested in him because her appearance was much less threatening compared to his. She knows that and doesn't care because she has no complaints about this marriage. Nor had he felt any point in ruining their relationship over something so trivial. When Carcel tried to counter-argue, Inés was short and direct, saying he is just a good specimen to marry. Carcel took a moment to process what she had said, then asked if she is sure she's right in the head. She approached Carcel and said she is perfectly fine. She knew exactly what it was to feel jealousy, and also knew how to feel anger, just as she knew what affection was. That's why she threatened to kill him if he cheated. While Carcel tilted his head in confusion for a moment, Inés continued saying that's how she is when she loves a man. So it's for that reason she didn't want to waste any energy on someone like him, someone she doesn't even like. Carcel wanted to say something more to her, but she had already heard enough. So he grabbed her arm, demanding that she listen. Inés continued to accuse, but he insisted on asking that she just listen to him for a second. Although he didn't understand why he was doing that or why he was holding her wrist, Carcel wondered how things had become so dramatic. Tears began to stream down her face as she asked him how she should understand his relationship with that woman. His eyes froze. He was dumbfounded by her face, which was distorted and soaked in tears. He put his arm around her shoulders, reassuring her that nothing had happened between them because she knows she is the only one who matters to him. But at the same time, Carcel wondered if he is really saying this, convincing himself that this can't be real. Inés continued crying, forcing herself not to believe his words. But Carcel's strong arms pressed her body against his until they both felt something. The moment Inés looked at him with wet eyes, it seems the server stopped responding. It was a shock that made time seem to stop. She tried to pull away abruptly from his tenacious grip. She was not willing to endure more insults. With a cry and realistically dramatic, Inés asked how he dares to have a hard banana in a situation like this. She felt him hold her tighter, so she clenched her fists and began to beat on his shoulder, while Carcel wondered how this situation makes any sense. Inés's tears intensified, begging him to let go and stay away from her because he is disgusting like a dog in heat. Carcel tried to explain that his body wouldn't have reacted like this if she wasn't in his arms, because she is the only woman who can leave him like this. Carcel firmly held Inés's shoulders and, as if there were nothing more romantic and true in the world, he declared that she is the only one who leaves him with a hard banana. A long silence hung over the room. He thought that if this was a dream, he hoped to wake up fast. But contrary to his sincere wish, ironically, Inés found it quite cute when he said that. She let down her hair and her dark curls fell over her narrow shoulders, which were exposed in an instant. She asked that Carcel prove she can trust him. He just needed to show how much he desired her. Inés slowly untied her nun's dress. The hands that until a moment ago were resting on her shoulders were now slowly undressing her. Carcel believed that this is definitely a dream, because this is impossible. He swallowed hard, seeing her body, and asked, almost stunned, why she isn't wearing anything underneath. Her simple, clean face was wet with tears and looked sad. But then she looked at him with a slightly wicked smile and declared that she never wears anything underneath every time she comes to see him, hoping that someday he would take her in his arms and know her body in a more intimate way. She had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Cárcel pulled Inés's head and kissed her. In his mind, he knew this must be a dream. It's just a cozy dream. There is neither sadness nor misery. It's just a little dream where Inés is undressed, and that's why he wishes he could never wake up from this dream. However, it all ended up revealing that it really was a dream, as he was awakened by the innocent face of his brother Miguel, who reminded him that he promised to train him this morning. Looking at the familiar ceiling, Cárcel began to think that Miguel's ceiling, this was a perfect dream that he would never want to wake up from. Cárcel looked at the wall while wetting himself in cold water, thinking of her words. And now he was convinced that he could live the life he wanted because his fiancée didn't care in the least. Thinking about it, Cárcel also blamed her for today's incident, waking up in a way he wished no one would look at. Honestly, he is even happy that she doesn't have any interest in him, because now he seemed to have become the happiest person in the world. A few minutes later, at the training field, someone called him captain and asked if he is aware that he has been repeating the same words to himself since he arrived. The man had never heard him talk so much, which meant he must be quite satisfied with what his fiancée had said to him. However, the bullet Cárcel fired passed close to the man, hitting a bird that fell to the ground in seconds. And then Cárcel said irritably that he doesn't even know how to shoot properly and yet keeps criticizing him for talking to himself. The man apologized and said that honestly, he is envious of him, because it's every man's dream, a wife who doesn't restrict her husband. Cárcel corrected him, saying she is not his wife yet. But the man argued that once married, a man is forced to live under the constant supervision of his partner. It's at that moment that they cease to be free. Cárcel asked what he is planning to do after he gets married, if he is already worried about his freedom, or if he thinks he's trash like him. The man tried to explain that he's just saying he is lucky to have such a caring and gentle fiancée who is willing to let him live the life he wants. Except that in Cárcel's own opinion, that woman isn't being caring toward him. In fact, she doesn't care at all. That's why she is perfectly fine regardless of what he does. At night on that same day, once again Cárcel was approached by a lady who was far too happy with her long vacation. She was thrilled to be able to see him all summer and saying that God had blessed him with a beautiful face and a body so strong and perfect that it made the girl envy his fiancé. She says he is the only one who gets her so excited like that. For some reason, Cárcel froze and suddenly asked the lady to step away from him. She complained that he can't do this to her because tonight he should be hers. But still, Cárcel asked for forgiveness and left her alone even with the girl begging for a second of attention. However, there was something strange in his head. He thought that those words he heard the lady say are the same ones Inés said in his dream, but that silly dream was supposed to be irrelevant, because things said in a dream shouldn't have any power over him. But then he wondered why this is happening. Why is his banana no longer rising? After marriage, he would have no other option besides Inés. Because of that, he shouldn't stop being able to continue. He believes this must be some kind of curse, or maybe it was just a temporary malfunction. Yes, it has to be that, because there was no chance of being considered impotent at that age. He tried to reassure himself, but since that night, every time he thinks of Inés, the problem resolves itself, the banana grows. Cárcel is convinced that he's not impotent. He's just broken. Seriously broken. And everything was fine. After all, Inés won't be there today anyway because she never shows up at these events even if invited by the host himself. However, he was completely wrong. Inés appeared in front of him, apologizing for the delay and informing him that she had planned to arrive on time. But an unforeseen event occurred. Cárcel couldn't close his lips, which were halfway open, and just stared at her blankly. At that moment, Inés's hand gently pushed his face forward and asked him to avoid making those undignified expressions in public. But he asked in a low whisper why she came here. Inés ignored him, and a strange discomfort hung between them. The silence was interrupted by his fiancée, who apologized for the incident. She wasn't sure of the reason, but it seemed that what had happened had left him a bit unbalanced. He asked if that's why she came today, but said he could have seen her any other time. Inés replied that she doesn't think a separate occasion is necessary for a simple meeting. Cárcel questioned if it's because they aren't close enough for that. She responded by asking if perhaps she has upset him again. He replied that this is both inconvenient and a cause for concern, which makes him seem like the uneducated one there. She leaned in closer, feeling how irritated he was that day, and asked why he is so grumpy today. This proximity made Cárcel flush intensely, as he realized her face looked more beautiful than in his dreams. Inés observed Cárcel's face carefully and said that lately he has been acting strangely odd. When he finally came to, he was already in the carriage. It even seemed to his fiancée that he was a bit out of control. However, Cárcel himself didn't understand why he behaved that way. After all, he didn't consider himself some kind of pervert or a teenager with out-of-control hormones. Inés even suggested that he get out of the carriage when he came to his senses, especially because they were already at his house. When he finally realized it was his house, he said in a cold sweat that this is his house. She made a look of displeasure and asked what the problem is, as she clearly remembers warning him that they were going to the Escalante residence. He apologized, pretending he was joking, but in fact he couldn't remember. Looking coldly at her fiancé, Inés had realized that having to see her is not very pleasant for him, but if he continues acting like this, it will be a problem for her too. Cárcel contradicts her, saying she knows very well he doesn't think she's an inconvenience. As soon as the carriage stopped, Cárcel got out first and then helped his fiancée out of the carriage. But she still felt he is acting strangely, and then, as in all the other times, she just interlaced her arms lightly. At that instant, he felt that the part that barely touched was hot, as if it had been touched by fire. He tried to pull his arm slightly away as if he were trying to avoid touching Inés as much as possible. But she, who valued dignified forms and angles, quickly corrected him. The staff at the official residence widened their eyes when they saw Inés entering the mansion with Lord Cárcel. She kept the same habitual expression as always, but Cárcel seemed to give a forced smile while reflecting that walking like this is far too torturous. Cárcel quickly led her to the reception room. He sat in front of her, which made her feel the space was too wide for such a personal conversation. So he asked if there is any reason they can't talk here. Cárcel said this room is private enough. Even if she wants to discuss something personal, don't worry and speak. Inés nodded and said that last time Cárcel had left so hurriedly that it wasn't possible to finish the conversation. Despite him having denied it himself, Inés's next words made his pride crumble. She said she appreciated her fiancé's effort in hiding the truth from her. She refers especially to his sincere attempts to keep his indecent lifestyle from being exposed, and she knew he did that out of respect for her. Cárcel decided to stand up and said he knows. Keeping the guilty party in the situation is him. With a smile inappropriate for that specific moment, Cárcel said she really seems to have lost her head. Inés stared for a moment, then lowered her head in disapproval. Then she asked that Cárcel sit and just let her finish what she wants to say. She told him she really meant it when she said she doesn't need to hide who he meets because she doesn't have any interest in him, just as she knows he doesn't have any interest in her either. Inés proposed that for the remainder of the engagement, they could simply continue like this, separated from each other's personal lives. This also applies to after the wedding. As long as neither of them behaves in a way that is openly disrespectful, each can do what they want and stay out of the other's personal life. At that moment, the smile disappeared from Cárcel's face. He already heard Inés say she doesn't like him, he's not worth killing, and he's not worth knowing. But at least he never heard words as significant as these. Cárcel tried to make sure he had heard correctly, asking if she is saying they can do what they want in private. Inés didn't answer, as if she had already made that very clear before. He rose quickly from the seat and then went to Inés and looked her steadily in the eyes before sitting on the table with his legs open on each side of her short dress, as if he wanted to confine her, to get up and leave if he didn't. Inés remained imperturbable by her fiancé's strange behavior and reminded him that people don't behave that way, because people sit in chairs, not on tables. However, Cárcel responded defiantly that he thinks he won't be cursed out of nowhere just because he sat on the table. She asked if by any chance he is still a child, but Cárcel explained that before calling him a child, she should consider the nonsense things she just said. He asked if this whole show she made was all for her beloved. Inés didn't understand who he is referring to or talking about, so he leaned closer to her and demanded she explain if she is doing this to be able to keep seeing him. Cárcel thought that this would explain everything. It would explain why she didn't care about his slips, why she let him do what he wanted. If it's for that man's sake, he can understand. Maybe it wasn't just one man, but several men. He can't even imagine how many men she might have seduced with that porcelain skin and sensual body. Considering her personality and the way she commands those around her, he is sure she would have been able to control anyone with just a few words. However, Inés refuted his speculations, making it clear she has no man, because the only reason she suggested that was to make things easier for him. She declared she just wants him to be free. After all, his perfect life was altered because of her. He ended up becoming her fiancé despite it being something he never wanted. He even had to take over the position of heir of House Escalante at such a young age, and all because of her. They should have married 7 years earlier, but Cárcel entered the military academy just to delay the wedding and ended up enlisting in the army. Still, Inés says that sincerely, he had only done her a favor. It wasn't that she didn't like him, she was just happy the wedding was postponed for an indefinite time. She said firmly that she is sure this means nothing to him. However, this phrase caused an internal contradiction in Cárcel, because what he really wanted to know is why this suddenly means nothing to her, if she wants to set everything aside just for his comfort. While he was lost in thought, Inés continued explaining that Cárcel boarded a warship and went to battle just to delay a life together with his not at all attractive nun-fiancé. Cárcel's heart began to beat rapidly because there was definitely some hidden motive there. Over the last 17 years, he saw all sides of Inés, which is why he is sure of it. Inés was willing to redeem herself with him, so she said she will make sure he has even more freedom after they marry. She will be his wife in name only, and will live a life separate from his. Suddenly, Cárcel practically leaned in to face her, looking directly into her eyes, and asked if she wants to live a life separate from her husband's. He pressed her into the sofa and, whispering near his fiancé's lips, questioned if she thinks that is really possible. Before Inés could counter-argue, Cárcel interrupted her words with a kiss, making her eyes widen, barely able to breathe. And when he gently pushed his tongue inside, her hands shivered to the point that he bit the lower lip of her mouth. Stopping he reminded her she had said they needed to make a baby together and asked if she no longer plans to do that with him. Without waiting for an answer, he apologized for ruining her plans, but they would not live separate lives. She would have to kiss him hundreds of times, and their bodies would meet thousands of times. Cárcel promised he wouldn't touch any other woman and will be by her side when she gives birth to their first child, and when the second is born, and the next. And even when they aren't making children. He will make sure to satisfy her and will make sure his wife does the same. Cárcel made it clear he doesn't need any freedom or personal life. She wants to give so much, because his definition of marriage doesn't include these things to begin with. He gently touched Inés's chin and said that even if she thinks he's a tremendous bastard scoundrel, still he is more faithful than she imagines. Now let's tell the story of Inés Valestena de Perez from her point of view. Inés's first life ended at age 26. Only those who have died know the duration of life. And she also knew the limits of her insignificant life because she has died before. But the knowledge she obtained didn't come only from death. After all, the end of her first life at age 26 was the result of her own decisions and no one else's. This happened a long time ago, but the feeling of despair experienced at that time was still fresh in her memory. She remembered that the last thing she saw was the idiot expression on the prince's face and the chaos that occurred on her 26th birthday. The only daughter of Duke Valestena had achieved the status of being part of the Grandes of Ortega. She had been born into one of the empire's most powerful families and was a lady who liked being covered in extravagant jewels. The Duke spared no expense to satisfy his daughter's tastes, leading her to be a constant leader in fashion in the city of Mendoza. In those days, noblewomen regularly applied almost toxic powders to their skin to make it look paler, but after Inés returned from a summer trip with tanned skin, the tanned look soon gained popularity. Inés was truly living a perfect life. Every week magazines were full of praise for the Crown Prince's fiancée for her class and dignity. She was loved by the Crown Prince and was living the life of a beautiful young Crown Princess. At that time, Inés was so happy with her perfect life that she strove to make it even more perfect every day. She pestered her seamstresses to make new dresses for her and scoured through countless invitations to decide which event would best improve her reputation and allow her to be the center of attention. Inés frequently went hungry to make her waist thinner, but because she wanted people to think she was born with a naturally thin body, she ate plenty every time she went to a formal dinner. However, she would vomit it all up soon afterward. If asked if she was living a normal life, Inés wasn't sure, but it was during this time that she began to be filled with doubts. She couldn't tell if she had done everything to become the perfect woman for the Crown Prince, or if she simply used him to achieve her perfect life. But she loved him. She loved him even if it had only been a few years, and even if he made her fall in love with his despicable lies, and even if her motives were vain and it was actually the reputation and status she loved. But at some point she wondered how it could have been love, how she could have loved someone like him, even a little. Inés suffered 4 spontaneous abortions of Oscar's children and was tormented by the imperial family, who scolded her for every loss, and by the empress who openly expressed her contempt in front of the people. That was her life as a married woman for 10 years. Oscar never stayed by her side, consistently ignoring her pleas for comfort. In fact, he even concluded she was born with a cursed womb that couldn't produce a living child. Although her life was wonderful on the outside, on the inside she was dying. Things became far from normal for her after she married. A normal life was simply impossible when she discovered that her pure and perfect husband had been infected with everything imaginable, from his depraved lifestyle, and that this had been the cause of all her dead children. When she was tortured by the memories of all those horrible nights when her disgusting husband forced his own body on her while she was pregnant, ignoring her rejection just to satisfy his own desires. He was the only man she ever had, and her body was now marked with all the proof of the depraved nights he had spent with other women. She had never done a single shameful thing in her life, yet she was being punished for having married that trash of a human being. Worse than the diseases he carried were his desires. He was well aware of the horrible diseases he carried, but not once did he hesitate to force his own pleasure on his modest wife. He never cared about his wife or about producing an heir. It wasn't even out of hating her, he simply did what he did without thinking of anything. When she looked at the life she had, she considered the 4 abortions as being a blessing. Even if one of those children had survived, it would have been an irreversible sin. The fact that she never gave birth to a single living child was the only consolation in her miserable life. On the day of her death, she had the last argument with Oscar. He pleaded for her not to do it, claiming she isn't able to think clearly. But Inés never thought as clearly as now. She never had the intention of killing him and toppling the Ortega family, because he wasn't even worth it. The imperial family never had divorced couples. Inés was determined to make Oscar more than a failure. She would turn him into a true flaw. He would be the first prince to make his wife commit suicide because she is going to kill herself. Because living with him disgusts her. She can no longer spend any other minute, no, not even any other second, with someone disgusting and dirty like him. And so she took her own life. No one could have reached a more peaceful conclusion. Her death didn't hurt anyone, not even the crown prince, who was little more than a sewer rat. The only wound he suffered was as a result of her will, in which she revealed all the details of his disgusting escapades. She didn't expect to receive any great compensation. She merely hoped that if there were a God, she would be taken to a better place. And with that, she closed her eyes, decided that it wouldn't matter even if that were not the case. So when she ended up in a hunting field where she spent her childhood, she had no idea what had happened. She began to run, breathing the fresh air and observing the vast green expanse while the wind played with her dark hair. But a boy ran right behind, calling her tirelessly and asking her to stop. She didn't listen. She kept running to a nearby tree and hitting it with her shoulder. Her brother Luciano looked at her as if she were crazy and asked what the hell got into her. Even without caring much, she whispered to herself that this really hurt. The pain is so vivid that Inés now is sure that this is not a dream. Later, stroking her brother's cheek repeatedly, Inés said that his face is so young that she can't believe the great Luciano Valistena is only a young man in his 19 years. He commented that she's doing it again, acting very strangely, and asked if by any chance she took her mother's medicine by mistake. A maid nearby said that perhaps Lady Inés is acting like this because of the wedding. Luciano agreed with that, saying that must be the reason. Inés leaned in to look at the maid, Juana, declaring that she is so beautiful and young, her skin looks so soft. The servant became awkward while Luciano asked Inés to stop because she's sounding like a dirty old man after young women. But she couldn't take her eyes off Juana's face. Even from her older brother, her entire life among the Valistenas came to an end when she turned 16. The moment he placed the veil over her head, she was unable to return to the Valistena castle until the time of her death. For the rest of her life, the people dear to her, the beautiful garden where she played with Luciano, and that place at the top of the castle became only distant memories. Inés had no idea what path things were taking or how the people she left behind changed. But now all these things miraculously appeared in front of her, exactly as they were. The last spring she spent in Valistena was 10 years ago. She leaned forward to stand up, reflecting that she is still in that time in Valistena. Looking like a lunatic at her own hands, Inés said to herself that spring hasn't passed yet. Luciano didn't understand why she continued acting strange, so he announced that in 4 months she would marry the crown prince. In fact, she will go to the city of Mendoza in 2 weeks. He said that everyone in Mendoza will try their best to find faults in her. After all, Prince Oscar is already too good for her. Suddenly, Inés grabbed her brother's neck and asked furiously who is too good for whom. She shouted in rage, asking who he said was too good for her. Luciano, who had fallen on the bed with his neck being crushed by Inés, couldn't say anything. She asked that he look her in the eyes and say it again, but Luciano replied that she clearly is not right in the head, so she shut his mouth by hitting him with a punch. Juana tried to ask her lady to stop, but Inés continued beating her brother even more violently for not answering her. She felt that this sensation feels too authentic not to be real. It was all real, both the despairs of her life at 26 and her naivety at 16 when she dreamed of becoming Oscar's wife. So none of this was a dream. She went back in time to when she was 16 and there were only 4 months left until the wedding. This moment is before everything in her life is ruined. In fact, she was rewarded with an opportunity and a blessing. This is her chance to end her life properly before going to heaven. At least, that was what she believed at that time. That was when she had experienced death only once. She left the room hurriedly and slammed the door. Standing outside, Inés reflected that she has already been engaged to Oscar for 10 years, and the wedding is already close, so she knows what reaction to expect. At that time, Oscar was practically a saint who bragged about having a good intellect and an upright image. He was the crown prince who preserved his chastity to share with his wife on the wedding night. But who would believe her if she said he would be frequenting brothels 2 years later and would be riddled with venereal diseases? There was no reason to waste this precious opportunity on a useless fight. Inés didn't want to marry Oscar again, and to avoid that she would have to be a bit more cunning. So if you wonder what happened to that woman who had obediently agreed to such a horrific marriage and stayed faithful to her husband, she felt that love could compensate for the fraudulent marriage that failed her in her first life. So when true love finally found her, Inés was taken in an instant. From the moment he saw her for the first time, he always knew that someone like him, a simple portrait artist, could never touch someone as noble as her in his entire life. In fact, the moment he saw her, he already knew he would be unable not to fall in love with her. The young man, smiling shyly, said his name is Emiliano, and Inés tried to pronounce his name softly. She learned Emiliano's name, and thus learned love. The 16-year-old girl disappeared from Valestina with him, and even without money, they lived a happy life together for 4 years. Until one day Emiliano was killed by Luciano in front of her, in front of their newborn son. The silence that hung over the place after the shots was interrupted by the crying of their baby, who was carried along with Inés by the Valestena men. She was taken as if she were a bundle of luggage, crying and hugging her baby while being pushed into a carriage. Emiliano, who managed to escape for a time with the help of another man, ended up returning on his own to die in front of her. In Duke Valestena's room, Inés's father said the Empress showed mercy, saying she would no longer marry the crown prince because she was now a tarnished object who had a child with a commoner. But it would be appropriate for her to become the second wife of Count Almenara. It didn't matter if it wasn't him, an elderly man of 50, or any other handsome man. As long as it wasn't Emiliano, it didn't matter who it was. He ended the conversation with Luciano, saying they have to make sure the marriage with the Count occurs without problems. And as for that disgusting son she gave birth to, it's better to eliminate his existence. Inés loved Emiliano too much. She couldn't breathe because there was no one else who could accept her love. The child was the only proof that Emiliano had ever lived by her side, but the world Emiliano had shown her was too big, and the child who looked like Emiliano was too small to be enough. Still, as she was the only one who could love him, Inés hoped that at least the child wouldn't have a painful death in an unknown place. With her own hands, she strangled her own 3-month-old baby. It was the last night she was allowed to spend with the child. The child was so weak he could easily have died the next day. But she decided to destroy her own heart and become a monster and end his pain. Sometimes a single name can change your world. For Inés, Emiliano was the only color in an all-black and white world. But the world that Emiliano had changed. Emiliano no longer existed. So she had to disappear too. She killed her own son. A woman like that will end up in hell. But even in hell, she will never forget Emiliano's name. So she stabbed herself before dawn. Back to the present, Inés thought it was a perfectly well-planned plan. She even chose a handsome man to marry so that he would then cheat. It was all so she could become the wife of the Duke of Escalante, who by chance happened not to live with him. Inés stopped writing for a moment, remembering what Cárcel said, that he may be a horrible bastard, but he is much more faithful than she thinks. She sighed deeply. Cárcel is the most handsome playboy in the empire, one capable of ruining a marriage easily. In this life, she had chosen him for that. But why is this plan, which has been in progress for 17 years, starting to crumble like this? Why on earth is Cárcel Escalante betraying her plans? Later, the maid Juana informed that womanizer finally wants to settle down, since he even sent a marriage proposal letter yesterday. But seeing Inés discontented, she asked what the problem is. She replied that him wanting to settle down is precisely the problem. Juana didn't understand this line of thinking because Lieutenant Escalante is perfect. The only problem he has is being a womanizer. Inés says she has already heard that a million times, so it would be nice not to have to hear it from her too, and asks that she stop keeping such a close eye on her legs. Strangely, Inés realized she had made a mistake and closed her mouth for a moment when she heard Juana say it's her first time doing that. But returning to the subject, she commented softly that she likes the way Escalante is now. The maid was shocked and asked if she likes to see him flirting with other women. Juana said her fiancé had said he didn't need that anymore. Perhaps he said some phrase to please her before the wedding, but still, he was a soldier, so it was unlikely he would make such statements easily. Inés said everyone lies. Soldiers lie to their superiors all the time. Even the priests in whom Juana had so much faith probably lied every now and then. But she was right about one thing. Escalante had said that only to please her, for he will never be able to change. It's exactly as she said. How could a dog turn into a man out of nowhere? And nestled into the sofa and stated that she is certainly not wrong about that, so her efforts were not in vain. Meanwhile, Cárcel's soldier had already obtained all the information. However, the protagonist looked at him with an expression of shock, then pushed him away while asking to stop acting so suspiciously. The soldier informed that she has no one. Lady Inés is well known for her decency and chastity, and that was why the cat had told him there was no way she had a man. According to the owl, she spends most of her time alone in a library, and according to what the rat said, they are in a position where they can watch everyone who frequents the Valestina residence. Escalante was already with his head boiling from these nicknames, but still he wondered who this man was. He just wanted to know his identity, if possible, see him personally. And she wears a mask of indifference, as if she wouldn't shed a single drop of blood even if she were wounded. But he wonders if she had already shown a smile cheerfully to another man. The soldier informed that Lady Inés's reputation is impeccable, from her behavior to her way of being. Cárcel replied that he had only obtained this information from people belonging to her family, so he needs other sources, and asked if he has done this type of work before. The man said, smiling, that this is his first time watching someone, just as it is the captain's first time too. Cárcel couldn't believe he is doing this. He never felt so curious about a woman's past. He even thinks he committed a gigantic crime by ordering his subordinate to spy on his fiancée. Of course, during this pathetic endeavor, his subordinate obtained information much faster than he had predicted. As expected, it was nothing special, and the answers he brought were so obvious. So, Inés has no one. He can't explain why he feels so relieved. He asked if it's possible his fiancée was just... The soldier, José, informed that he heard all the maids laughing at this assumption. They said that Lady Inés sees men as insects. Furthermore, no one had said anything to increase suspicion. But it seems some women Cárcel had met in the past did their own investigations on the lady in hopes of finding a weak point in her. Whatever the reason, the maids seemed well used to answering such questions, so he had no idea how many times those women had been questioned, since his investigation didn't arouse suspicion. Cárcel began to reflect that there was a time when she was very attached to him, but now Inés stopped being in love with him. He had no idea that something like that could be happening behind his back. Those women were looking for weaknesses in his fiancée, whom he doesn't even love. They were planning to use anything they found against her. Who could he blame if not himself? This is all because of his face, but such things will never happen again. José commented that the captain had already sent the marriage proposal letter to the Duke of Valestina, but what would he do if he discovered a weakness? Cárcel questioned why he would do such a thing. He had made a promise. Besides, they are talking about the marriage of two noble houses of Ortega, a promise between families. Carcel sighed and explained he wouldn't consider it something negative if she had a man. After all, he himself had already had many women. So it would be irrational on his part to say he couldn't marry because he suspected his fiancée had affairs on the side. Furthermore, regardless of whether he wanted this marriage or not, from age 6 until now, he never had considered a life in which he wasn't married to Inés. Jose seemed to have a worried expression, then asked when the captain would return to Castella. Carcel warned that after his wedding, which would happen within 2 weeks, he said that would be the longest vacation period he could take that summer, including the leave for the wedding, and Jose would also have to go back with him, so he would need to use all the vacation time he has too, including his winter vacation. 10 days before the wedding, a dinner was held at the Valistena family residence. An elegant silence hangs over the most awkward dinner, with only the occasional sound of cutlery clinking against each other. It was a dinner where no one opened their mouth, as if they had made a promise. Who suddenly broke it was the Duke of Valistena, who said he heard that Carcel maintains a very quiet lifestyle, considering everyone in Mendoza knows of his escapades. Unless he is completely deaf not to know. The Duke said it's fine. A man should enjoy what he can. But Carcel, who was trembling, replied that by no means. So he asked if he didn't enjoy it. Why did he do it? Carcel explained he just couldn't think clearly. Lionel Valistena had thought all this time that he was just unfaithful, but now he thinks he lacks brains too. If lack of virtue could be considered a talent, Carcel would be one of the greatest geniuses to grace the empire. Carcel looked away from the Duke's disdainful eyes while hearing him ask if what Carcel is saying is that an idiot like him thinks he is worthy of having his daughter's hand. Carcel knew the atmosphere wasn't good. To relieve it, he said that if he will officially take Inés as his wife, he will make sure not to disappoint Mr. Valistena. However, the Duke was already disappointed just by his presence. The simple fact that he is breathing at this exact moment was already disappointing enough. Inés, who watched the situation in silence while eating her meal, suddenly hit the table, demanding her father stop being so petty, especially because he was the one who invited Carcel. The Duke literally exploded with his daughter's reaction, asking if she called him petty. Inés responded by asking why he questions when he already knows the answer. Lionel could easily have cracked his skull but didn't. He even changed his plans to offer a decent dinner, but the only reason he didn't do anything is because this fellow was acting as if he wasn't going to marry his daughter. Inés said rumors suggest that, but the fact is they are going to marry. And her father knew that too, so she asked that they leave her fiancé alone. When the argument ended, Carcel looked at Duchess Valistena, unable to believe what he was witnessing. Sitting between the Duke and Inés, she was busy drinking whiskey, which wasn't wine, as if it were wine. Suddenly, Inés broke the silence, saying she is the only one enjoying the meal since it seems no one is eating much tonight. Miguel replied breathlessly that the food is delicious. Then he turned his head and asked Carcel if he doesn't agree. Inés also wanted to know if everything is to his liking. The Duke clicked his tongue upon hearing Carcel respond that everything is so perfect, then commented next that he is surprised he hasn't praised the woman he is about to marry a single time. Already losing patience with her father, Inés wanted to know how exactly he should be praising her. If the Duke of Escalante could at least say she was especially beautiful that night, that the dress looks dull compared to her beauty. When Carcel dared to make a compliment to Inés, she immediately shut her mouth, because the Duke wouldn't tolerate his daughter being treated that way. He neglected his daughter until she lost her youth, and now he decided to appear there with the intention of marrying within 2 weeks. The Duke had even considered that Carcel might have caught a venereal disease and was about to give up, but now he must be being pressured to produce an heir before dying. Looking into Inés's eyes, Carcel felt his body tremble. The cold look she directed at the Duke was so fierce and frightening that it was the first time he witnessed a look like that. Then she rose from the table, for it wasn't right to treat a guest that way. Inés said that Lord Carcel is an honored lieutenant of the Imperial Navy and didn't sell his body or steal anything. Of course, there were many defects in him that could be criticized without distorting the truth. The Duke of Valistena had reason to act that way. His daughter wasn't getting any younger as the years passed, and her fiancé abandoned his marriage plans and wandered the seas. Carcel already expected him to be furious, but had no idea her family would be so strongly against the marriage. And the fact that the engagement hadn't been canceled yet was surprising. Now Carcel understood why the Duke never protested when he kept making excuses to delay the wedding. He wanted the marriage to be canceled by the Escalante family. Inés has already passed the age at which most women in Ortega marry, but as she carries the Valistena name, it shouldn't be a problem to receive marriage proposals from other respectable families. Inés declared that Valestena and Escalante are not just common noble families, but families recognized as grandes of Ortega, so the promises between families cannot be in vain. Furthermore, she confessed she is fine with her engagement because she loves Lord Cárcel. Cárcel finally realized the reason this marriage proposal continued until now. Inés didn't like him, didn't care what he did, but she wanted him anyway. And he also realized one more thing that night. She smiled most beautifully when she is lying. After dinner, when everyone was going to the reception room, the Duchess declared she has a completely different opinion from the Duke, for she had always liked him. She always told Inés, too, that he was too good for her. The woman was already drunk but still demanded his attention. Cárcel quickly asked her to continue. Then she admitted that Inés isn't the daughter she wanted, for everything she has ever done was a disappointment. The Duchess explained that she wasn't always like this. There was a time she was so lovely and lovable, but after a horrible fever she had one day, she changed. Since then, everything she does disappoints her. Even now, she looks like a witch and asked if Cárcel really thinks he'll be able to stand living with her. But contrary to the Duchess, Cárcel reflected to himself that he actually thinks she is very beautiful. Inés's mother could see how he could find this idea of living with her intolerable. After all, she is sure that is the reason he tried so hard to delay the wedding. The thought of sharing a bed with her must be terrifying for him. Her appearance alone is enough to make anyone vomit. Cárcel realized the Duchess truly seemed to hate Inés, even as she begged him to fix her daughter, whom she believed was suffering from some unbearable mental illness. It was simply insufferable. It was as if she spent her entire day trying to shame her own child. Cárcel clenched his fists, feeling the Duchess was going too far just to air a grievance about her daughter. However, he widened his eyes when she claimed that, back then, she believed someone had swapped Inés's soul with another person's. She described how Inés would sometimes do the most malicious things, as if a demon had taken over her body. When she was young, there were times she threatened or even physically hurt herself, just to show she wouldn't listen to a single word her mother said. All the Duchess had done was try to make her beautiful, but for no apparent reason, her entire behavior changed and she began to ignore her. Because of this, she decided to teach her a lesson by putting her in a barrel and even forced her to wear prettier clothes. But she only did these things for her own good. Even today, Cárcel saw how she behaved during dinner. The wedding was a week away, yet she stuffed herself with all the food she could. The Duchess couldn't understand what kind of noble lady acts that way, saying she reminded her of an animal putting its head in a pot of food. And it wasn't as if she used makeup since she dressed like a witch. The least she could do was skip some meals to maintain her weight, as that was her only good quality. As she spoke, Cárcel could hardly believe what he was hearing. The Duchess said a mother should help her daughter be loved by her husband and not do something to tarnish her reputation. But the way Inés looked at her that day was so fierce that from that moment on, her daughter's fate spiraled out of her control. She could do nothing to help her for fear of her own life. For this reason, the Duchess handed over the responsibility of fixing her daughter, who was truly sick, into his hands. But Cárcel replied that fixing her daughter was not something he had the right to do. On the other hand, the Duchess argued that he would soon be her husband and her master. Cárcel refuted this. He would be her husband, nothing more, and Inés was the only woman he would lie with from now on. The Duchess burst into laughter as if she had heard something very funny. At that sound, Inés and Miguel looked in their direction at the same time from a distance. Amidst her laughter, she mentioned one thing that managed to win her approval. When Inés put a chain around his neck to make him hers when he was so young he didn't even know what was happening. Cárcel didn't understand. Her words made it sound as if Inés had drugged him into agreeing to the engagement. He remembered being 6 years old at the time when it was announced he would have to marry Inés, and he had cried all day because he was afraid. But Inés was different. She knew exactly what she was doing. She is the devil, the Duchess murmured meaningfully, as if talking about someone other than the Inés visible in the distance. The atmosphere at the Valestena house, which had regained some appearance of peace, was now quite slow. Perhaps it was because the atmosphere was very different. Cárcel watched Luciano and Miguel talking before looking at Inés, who suddenly called for him. She was drinking water from her wine glass just as she had during the meal. Inés apologized to her fiancé for her father's behavior. Even though Cárcel was aware of his own flaws, she felt guilty and wanted him to pay no attention to her father's words and continue doing as he pleased. Cárcel replied that he was already doing exactly that. She affirmed this, noting that he had even set the wedding date, without any warning. Now she would have to wear her mother's horrible 27-year-old dress for the wedding. Inés warned him that what he did was selfish, but she understood he was only doing what he believed was right. Regardless, she wanted to marry him and had no objections, as she had been waiting for him for a long time. Though it might be sudden, she would accept it with a smile. Cárcel knew her motives for wanting this weren't pure, but Inés argued he was too good to be tied down by a commitment, especially since she liked seeing how free he was and didn't want to see him wither under the weight of rules and obligations. After all, a flower dies when plucked from its natural environment. Cárcel asked what nonsensical gibberish she was talking. It was one thing to compare a grown man to a flower, but now she honestly seemed to be trying to brainwash him. Inés responded as if shocked, asking why he would say that. He explained that she was talking to him as if she were trying to control his mind and wanted to know exactly what she was trying to do. Inés admitted she wasn't trying to do anything, but Cárcel, having already kissed her, thought he had made his intentions quite clear. She explained that his kiss was merely an effort to put into her head that he was prepared to do whatever was necessary to satisfy his sense of obligation, even if it meant kissing a woman like her. Cárcel was completely indignant at her use of those words, but he didn't feel obligated to do it and never expected to put anything into her head. He recounted how she had said she liked him and then later declared she didn't, and now she was acting like this out of nowhere. She also claimed she didn't want to waste her energy but was actively pushing him to the limit as if she couldn't wait to get rid of him. Cárcel asked if she had liked him at any point in all those years. If so, then when did she start to hate him? But Inés didn't understand why he was so angry that she didn't like him and reminded him that he was the one who chose to lead a disordered life. It was true he was forced into this engagement and was also about to be forced into this marriage, so he had no obligation to be faithful to her. She understood why he acted that way. But Cárcel promised that after the wedding, things would be different. However, Inés refused to believe that someone like him, who lived his life like a dog all this time, would suddenly talk about becoming a saint. Cárcel explained she would believe it when they went to their bedroom, but she made it clear they would sleep in separate rooms. He whispered that sooner or later, they would sleep together. On the other hand, Inés countered that she wouldn't lie down with a dog, but Cárcel leaned in to kiss her and whispered that dogs are animals that live among humans, so he didn't want her to release him into the wild as she saw fit. He lowered his head and gently kissed the corner of her mouth, and gradually Inés slowly opened her mouth so their lips could fully meet. The kiss deepened with every breath that escaped between their locked lips. When Inés was panting, he lightly sucked her upper lip and pulled away to warn her that even if she let the dog go, he would always return home. Cárcel warned her not to waste her energy on a fight she wouldn't win. Suddenly he stopped as if breathless, thinking that if things continued this way, it would be very dangerous. Inés quickly moved out of Cárcel's reach, then raised her hand toward him and slapped his ear. For a moment, Cárcel thought it was the Duke of Valistena who saw their kiss and rushed to slap his eardrum, but it was still quiet around them, and Inés was the only one in front of him. He only regained consciousness when she mentioned he had taken a slap from her, but she didn't understand why he seemed so surprised. It surely wasn't the first time he'd been slapped by a woman. Cárcel recounted that it was actually the first time, and she had slapped his head, not his face. Inés sighed in distaste at the thought of being his first, and confessed it was a bit bothersome for her, but soon changed the subject. She warned that dogs should stay outside, and that was exactly how she would raise an animal. It should never be allowed to enter its master's bedroom, much less their bed. Since he had started it, Inés decided to set some boundaries herself, asking that when the time came, he just get to the main part quickly and not do any of this greater foolishness like now. Cárcel asked what the main part was. She replied it was the basic necessity, and he knew exactly what she was talking about. Inés said kissing was unnecessary, too intimate, too close, and a waste of time. Furthermore, his marriage would be a joke anyway. All the nobles would laugh when the man who avoids his fiancée suddenly decides to marry in 2 weeks. But it was fine if he found it funny too. Cárcel looked at her with strange eyes for a while and said he never thought of any of this as funny because the only future he had in mind was her being his wife. That was why he kissed her. It wasn't because he loved her, but because she would soon be the most important woman in his life. Cárcel apologized for his rudeness. Since they were about to be married, he carelessly assumed it would be fine to kiss her now. He promised not to do anything she didn't like. They weren't in love, so if it made her feel uncomfortable, he would respect her decision and do nothing more that she told him not to do. Inés's eyes changed strangely at his serious observation. There was also a slight sense of difficulty, as if she were wondering what would become of her if he acted like that. Cárcel leaned in closer to her, declaring that for now he would assume she was fine with everything except kissing. As the saying goes, you have to listen to what someone says until the very end to understand. But Inés sometimes thought there were words she wouldn't understand even after hearing them through. She stood there with a perplexed look on her face, still not fully understanding the conclusion Cárcel had reached so clearly. And so time passed, and the wedding day finally arrived. At the sound of the bells, the wedding melody echoed through the ceremony. Waiting for Inés at the altar was Cárcel, who was completely stunned by her appearance. The white color suited her perfectly. The long eye contact trapped the man in his thoughts until the couple made their vows and sealed the union with a kiss. The wedding ceremony was steeped in an atmosphere of solemnity and religiosity. Only the imperial family and 17 noble families were invited. Although the event couldn't be considered grand, no one regretted attending. Regardless of what was said, the situation remained calm and peaceful. During the banquet, Cárcel watched the dancers. To be more precise, he was looking for his bride, who should have been by his side. The image of Inés dancing with her brother Luciano appeared and disappeared repeatedly amongst the dancing couples. Inés's movements followed Luciano's example. Smooth as flowing water, the hem of her dress fluttering like a blooming flower bud, catching the attention of others. Cárcel narrowed his eyes so as not to lose sight of Inés among the men and women circulating around. Suddenly, someone spoke to him, asking if he thought the music was too long since he couldn't take his eyes off his wife for a second. This someone was Dante, the eldest son of the Duke of R, famous for being old-fashioned, with his brown hair neatly slicked back and an elegant appearance. This noble, who resembled Cárcel's father and was known for being conservative, actually enjoyed a fairly free private life in the shadows. Compared to this guy, Cárcel looked like a priest. He was a scoundrel who kept hidden mistresses all over the city of Mendoza. 2 weeks ago, the Duke of Valestena had tried his best to assert that there were many other young suitors who could replace Cárcel as Inés's fiancé. The Duke cited 3 suitors. The first was Henrique Osorno, known for his intelligence and academic achievements. The second was Leonardo Elvis, someone Inés could control at will since he was many years younger than her. And finally, a man with a decent face and a well-guarded personal life, Dante, who was considered by others never to have strayed from the right path. Cárcel found it amusing that he himself was one of the competitors. Dante mentioned that people were betting Cárcel would spend this night with another woman on his own wedding day. However, Dante soon apologized for upsetting him, merely saying he thought those people had made a mistake and would lose the bet. Because now it was clear why Escalante couldn't take his eyes off Inés. He even thought Cárcel might faint right in the middle of the ceremony. Cárcel knew it was obvious everyone would be surprised. Inés was still receiving a combination of surprised, admiring, and shocked looks from everyone. She smiled gently at those looking at her perplexed while simply ignoring those who irritated her. She acted naturally, as if she had always ruled over the other nobles of high society. But Inés was still Inés. All she had changed was her hair and clothes. She might be smiling, which was rare, but it was just another expression she wore. Even so, everyone treated her as if everything about her had changed. Dante doubted she was enough for Cárcel, even though all this novelty might be surprising him now. Even regarding the bet, Cárcel hadn't realized her body was like that since she always wore clothes that showed nothing. Dante mentioned she was always beautiful, even fully covered. But her body, Cárcel interrupted at that instant, asking what about her body. Dante smiled and confessed he hadn't said anything, but regardless, he thought it was an unimaginable stroke of luck for him. Cárcel replied that he had imagined it before, so he wasn't surprised. Dante lowered his head with a secret smile, declaring he wouldn't interrupt his friend's good times, but asked that he just give him a chance if Cárcel got tired of being a newlywed, so he could console his wife. Cárcel was infuriated and warned the man that if he was tired of living, he would have the pleasure of killing him. However, Dante didn't care about the threat. On the contrary, he continued saying that many women went after him without him lifting a finger. It was truly unfair. He could do everything he wanted, but he didn't think Inés would just stay at home urgently. Furthermore, if she found a lover, he bet it would be much easier for him to rid himself of the guilt he felt for the woman who loved him since she was 6. Cárcel paused to observe Inés. Despite her not-so-sociable personality, Inés was an extremely talented dancer, and seeing her dance, he couldn't help but feel guilty for his years as a scoundrel. Dante's final words before leaving continued to haunt him. He knew he was being very selfish and didn't even have the right to demand any fidelity from her, but he didn't want to share that beautiful smile with any other man. Cárcel remembered the feeling of dancing with Inés, the moment she was gently held in his arms, moving her feet lightly, the face that smiled affectionately, though falsely, and her beautiful straight collarbone, the plump chest beneath it, and the lush valley unfolding before his eyes as she danced, drove him mad. Still lost in thought, Cárcel was approached by his cousin, Crown Prince Oscar, who commented that he seemed quite bored. He talked about the best wine of the Valestina family, which the Duke had refused to give him a single bottle of before, even when he begged. But it seemed he was finally willing to let go of the wine for Cárcel, since he was now his son-in-law. Without giving Cárcel room to speak, Oscar admitted that if Inés had opted for Enrique Osorno, he would have had an easier time accepting it. But he still didn't understand why she chose someone like Cárcel Escalante. Oscar commented that even now Enrique and Inés looked so good together and asked if Cárcel wasn't jealous. After all, Inés was incredibly beautiful. He even imagined Escalante would want to chain her to his side at all times, though he doubted that would make for a happy marriage. Cárcel questioned what someone who wasn't even married knew about marriages. The prince responded in an indifferent tone that there were things he could simply say even without experiencing them, and with an ironic smile warned that Cárcel could continue being bored. As it seemed, Enrique was keeping his wife well entertained in his stead since she was smiling. Crown Prince Oscar was now 27 years old. Even after being rejected by her at age 10, he secretly continued trying to court her without success. Eventually, he ended up engaged to Marquise Barca's niece, who was now 22 and past the usual age of marriage, but the prince rejected her with the ridiculous excuse that she looked too young. Cárcel mentally cursed his cousin as a bastard and reminded him that she smiled plenty during the first dance they had. Oscar smiled, saying the first time she smiled at him, she faked it. He then reached for the wine glass that had been left on Inés's empty seat. Cárcel snatched the glass from the prince's hands, since it was a glass that had touched Inés's lips, and drank it in one gulp. Oscar laughed at the exaggerated reaction, but Cárcel warned that he could drink from his own glass, but his bride's was completely out of bounds. Suddenly, the conversation shifted to Dante. According to Oscar, Cárcel wouldn't need to worry about that noble because he would go bald like his father. He even gave Cárcel some advice to look after himself, saying jokingly that his uncle didn't have much hair either. Cárcel laughed, mocking that the emperor also seemed to have baldness, so his son might share the same problem, which left the crown prince very irritated. After this very serious discussion, Cárcel looked at Inés again, letting his words escape as if saying, "This no." And as expected, Inés was laughing again as he watched, imagining she wasn't just smiling. She seemed to be laughing out loud. After the banquet ended, Inés felt hungry, but Juana forbade her from eating as it could cause a protruding belly during the wedding night. Furthermore, she had eaten plenty at the banquet earlier. She had even seen the Duchess staring as if she wanted to kill her. Inés commented that she couldn't kill her even if she wanted to, since she was an Escalante now. Juana asked what provoked this sudden change in her to dance and talk so much with other nobles. She replied it was her wedding, so it was normal. Juana commented on how all the gentlemen at the banquet stared wide-eyed at her. It seemed everyone wanted to court her. The Duke and Duchess were satisfied at first, but then became worried. Inés spoke to Juana as if praising her for the good work of making her beautiful, but Juana didn't seem very satisfied, so Inés shrugged and declared they weren't interested in her. They were just reacting to her excellent work. Juana asked her to stop joking and said she didn't understand how they could flirt with Lady Inés so openly. Even the young ladies began to act so friendly. It was as if they were naturally superficial, especially young men. Inés gave a mischievous smile and confessed she had also been superficial, even more so than them. Juana didn't remember her being like that. She replied it was a wedding after all, so keeping the atmosphere light was the best thing to do. As superficial as it might have been, being the envy of all the young noble ladies and the desire of all the noble men was something she hadn't experienced since her first life. But even a small taste was enough to leave her exhausted. When she lived that life with Emiliano, every day was a frustratingly miserable struggle to survive. Even if those days were memories to laugh at now, the rage and despair she constantly felt weren't at all funny. Although those memories had now weakened, there was one night that made it all worth it. Back then, she didn't have a mirror, so she couldn't examine herself. She only watched Emiliano's expression and guessed how she should wear the veil. Juana asked why she accepted all those dance requests without complaining. She replied she couldn't allow Cárcel to be humiliated or despised, since it was his first wedding. During the marriage, she would cause him no harm, nor stray from her duties as a wife. She wouldn't give him a single reason to ask for a divorce. Thus, the rest of her plan should continue without problems. Now she would go to the room. After all, this was only the beginning. The wedding ceremony and the celebration banquet occur exclusively for the amusement of others. The true contract of marriage is completed on the wedding night. In the aristocratic world, if nothing happens on the wedding night, the marriage can simply be annulled the next day as if nothing happened. And still, if the terms set by both parties are not met, even a marriage where consummation has occurred can be undone. Of course, that doesn't happen frequently. Cárcel knew they only needed to get through this wedding night peacefully, and at least Inés still seemed to want this marriage. As for Duke Valestena, he continued threatening to annul the marriage if there was any problem, but he wouldn't be able to do that as long as Inés wanted to stay in it. She has haunted him in both his dreams and reality, and in the meantime, it seemed Cárcel's desires had been repressed. Time passed painfully slowly, and when everyone saw her the way he imagined her to be, he thought he would go crazy. He prayed this night would pass quickly and everything would be fine with the world. After this night, the nightmare would finally end. Inés Escalante, wife of Cárcel Escalante, her name would be added to the Escalante family tree, and Cárcel would take her away from Duke Valestena to a place where they could be alone, to the new mansion on the coast of Castella. He didn't believe this day would come, but there he was now. There was no doubt he had finally gone mad the moment he sent the marriage proposal. He decided he wouldn't spend the honeymoon in Mendoza or Esposa, but in Castella, where his fleet is docked. Cárcel swore it had no special meaning and was certainly not because he desperately wanted to be alone with her. But he brainwashed himself into thinking so and found a rational reason for it. It seemed he had truly fallen in love with Inés. At that moment, the bedroom door opened slowly, and all thoughts of doubt vanished from Cárcel's mind as his wife entered the room. At the banquet, men commented that Inés seemed particularly seductive, and they wanted to find a way to seduce her. In their opinion, her beauty exceeded all expectations, but she wouldn't be able to keep Escalante's interest for long. Now they couldn't wait for him to turn his back on her. After all, nothing would be easier than consoling a broken-hearted woman. Cárcel, who observed everything, made sure to find out the names of all those voices and promised that everyone would pay the appropriate price in silence. Back in Inés's room, Cárcel stood up when his bride entered. Inés, standing inside the door wearing a shirt that revealed her entire body, slowly began to take off the lingerie covering her shoulders. His breathing had stopped, the silence was wonderful and perfect, but it wasn't clear if it would last. Inés, having checked Cárcel's expression, was looking at him with a subtle expression that was neither smiling nor completely expressionless. Cárcel's expression slowly distorted as he asked if she walked all the way there like that. Inés replied with indifference that she always had a bit of that exhibitionist part inside her. Cárcel was in shock to hear this, which made her quickly explain it was just a joke. Like a boy seeing a woman's body for the first time, Cárcel couldn't take his eyes off her breasts. When he finally realized what his eyes were doing, he let out a nervous sigh and repeatedly rubbed his face. With cold green eyes, Inés asked if he wasn't going to act as if telling her to hurry up and do things in order, as if he didn't know where to start or how to start. To where? Cárcel asked. To the bed. Inés replied coldly and softly at the same time. Bed. Just because she said that word, Cárcel reflected that he had experienced dozens of positions with Inés in his dreams, but in the midst of it all, his limbs were now rigid as if broken. Noticing Cárcel's strange behavior, Inés decided to make it easy for him, gently sliding the strap of her nightgown. Her hair, still slightly damp, was combed and oiled to look a little wetter than it actually was, and at the same time made Inés's white face look strangely sexy. It seemed Inés was still asking him something, but nothing reached his ears. Cárcel was completely absorbed in the beautiful breasts that had been briefly revealed. But looking at Inés's full lips and green eyes, he clearly heard her ask if he needed her to take his clothes off. As there was no response from Cárcel, Inés perhaps thought he preferred to stay dressed, so she slightly pulled the strap back, commenting she didn't mind doing it with clothes. Suddenly, Cárcel got angry with himself. How could he be so indifferent? In one step, he reached his bride, grabbing her hand and asking who she was trying to provoke by putting her clothes back on. The round green eyes that rarely showed surprise were beautiful to look at, which made Cárcel feel his lower part get even harder. He leaned in slowly and warned that she must never even dream of putting her clothes back on in front of him without prior warning. Inés saw Cárcel crouch down and suddenly grab her legs. Her body was lifted into the air with such ease it was ridiculous. As the two looked fixedly at each other, he began to carry Inés to the bed. When she accidentally brushed her feet against Cárcel's hard banana, she lost her breath. She looked at Cárcel, who seemed to be feeling discomfort in his pants, and wondered if he got like that so quickly just because she took off a bit of clothing. Thinking that for someone who went mad he seemed terribly lucid, a calm sea, a sunrise over a forest, a fire in front of a cabin, Inés had to think only of peaceful things. This marriage was planned by her, and the wedding night is part of this plan. She is mentally prepared for this and convinced that he will soon fall asleep. Cárcel lightly touched her thigh and slid his hand, undressing Inés's dress, and gently he stroked his wife's beautiful face, which seemed to express she was feeling nothing. Cárcel leaned in closer to observe her face more clearly. Inés finally lost her patience and opened her mouth, asking if he wasn't going to start. For a moment, there was a sound like he was laughing. Then he replied that her expression looked like she was going to war. Inés scolded Escalante to hurry up and do his job. Cárcel kissed her hand and asked if she was still calling him Escalante, even in bed. She looked at him with a somewhat cautious expression and said it was just a habit. Cárcel slowly began to take off his shirt and reminded her that Inés was also an Escalante now. If she called him by that name, it would be hard to tell from the outside if it was him or Miguel opening her legs now. While Inés doubted her ears, he threw the shirt away and forcefully pushed his body against hers, making her body tremble. She tried to push him away with her hand. It was perfectly normal since he is a healthy man with a good body, but she still didn't expect him to be so large. She pulled away a bit more, but a large hand grabbed her waist and prevented her from escaping. Cárcel said that when she started feeling good, she should say his name properly so everyone outside could hear her. He gently tried to kiss her lips, but Inés reminded him, lips no. So he kissed her exposed neck, whispering that she indeed said lips were out of bounds. Inés said she didn't say that so he could kiss every other place. Cárcel asked if she didn't like it or if he would have to kiss her from head to toe to see which place he wasn't allowed to kiss. Inés said, almost stuttering, that it wasn't that she didn't like it was just that she felt strange. But he hadn't even done anything strange yet. Cárcel's lips, descending down her neck to her breasts, bit her fleshy skin several times as if leaving marks wherever his lips rested. Marks were left like flower petals that had fallen to the ground. Inés opened her mouth slightly, as if in pain, but it wasn't what it seemed. Quickly, Inés covered her mouth with her hand to contain the sound coming from her, which was impossible to hold back otherwise. But this unnecessary will was also so difficult to resist. Before she could go mad, Inés warned that Cárcel couldn't do things like that, and knew he was only trying to make her feel good. Cárcel asked if she was saying he shouldn't be making her feel good, and if she didn't like feeling good. Trying to regain her breath, Inés said she wasn't a pervert. He said he knew, which is why he was asking if she liked it or not. She wanted to know why he was so interested in that. Cárcel replied so that he could remember because he wouldn't do anything she didn't like. Inés immediately changed the subject, thanking him for the concern. But she knew he never wanted this marriage. However, he said furiously for her not to start with that again. Cárcel said suddenly that he was the one who sent the marriage proposal, even making a sudden request to her father so he could deliver it in 2 weeks. And the Duke made sure to curse him every day. Until today. In the end, he was the one who wanted this marriage too. It didn't matter if she liked him or not, or if he liked her or not. She wanted this marriage, he wanted this marriage, and that was all. Cárcel traced a brief smile as he slid his hand from Inés's waist down between her legs and asked if he could have a look. Inés responded by asking if she said no. He said it was true that everything he was doing was unnecessary if the only goal was for her to get pregnant. When she replied she was fine with that, Cárcel asked if she wanted her husband to take her clothes off and possess her, maddened like an animal. Because that was exactly what she was telling him right now. She wanted him to take her against her will without considering her feelings in the slightest. Cárcel said she was asking him to do what he wanted without further ado. On the other hand, Inés admitted she already agreed to all of it. However, Cárcel asked her to just say she didn't want him because she thought he was disgusting. He would believe it more easily if she just said she wanted it over quickly because she preferred not to lie with a used rag like him. Her body was so pure that even if this strange mind of hers came up with crazy ideas, he would have nothing to say against it. Inés replied it wasn't like that. She really wanted him to get along, which is why she was telling him to do what he wanted with her. Cárcel quickly pulled off the nightgown Inés was wearing, without even waiting for her to finish speaking. Then he lay on top of her, with their upper bodies already unclothed. When he rubbed his hand down there, Inés shivered slightly, startled by the unexpected action. Cárcel rose from on top of her and said if she wanted to do the minimum so much, then he would need her help to do what she wanted. Inés's green eyes turned to Cárcel's face without understanding what he was saying. He explained that it takes quite a while, so the way it was now, they would probably be there until morning. Inés pushed him away and said she understood what he meant. She rose slowly and went to where he was kneeling. For her, it was an irritating topic, but there was nothing to be done. Cárcel knew she was only being used and would give up on her own, as there was no way she would touch something she had never seen before. When she gave up, he would start to take her properly and continue all night. However, Cárcel realized that the movements Inés was making with her hands were not the movements of someone unfamiliar. He wondered where and with whom she had done this, but he himself didn't deserve to know. He shouldn't feel jealousy, much less have these insignificant doubts. The desire to possess her took over him. When he felt her warm lips, he couldn't contain this horrifying desire any longer. So Cárcel took Inés, threw her on the bed, and pushed everything forcefully inside her. He was just a bastard idiot for thinking differently from the start. What Inés wanted from him was for him to be a mere animal without intimacy or consideration, merely to give her a successor. If he couldn't cover his ears, he wanted at least to cover her lips, but he had no right to kiss those lips. He had no right to feel angry or even want to know her hidden past. There was an exclusive girl who didn't want to meet anyone, and there was a boy who was the only exception. He thought he was the only window, the bridge, and the only connection to the outside world in that closed life. Sometimes he pitied the girl and gave her attention. He secretly swallowed the warped satisfaction that he was everything in that little world. But what remained before the boy's eyes was the other side where the bridge had been cut, and he himself had been pushed there as the world. Now he can feel that strange satisfaction crumbling beneath his feet. The next day, the Duchess fell into tears, mentioning she always knew this day would come but couldn't believe it finally had. She said yesterday's events seemed so unreal they felt like a dream, but seeing the two of them sitting together like that, she was finally starting to believe it was real, and that a huge weight had finally been lifted. She wondered what she had done wrong to deserve such shame, but finally Inés had become a woman. She feared her daughter would wear those horrible black rags for the rest of her life and end up having the engagement canceled. Already exhausted from hearing his wife's laments, the Duke asked Olga to stop. However, she continued, saying that if the marriage had been canceled and she married someone insignificant, she would have preferred to send her daughter to a convent, so as not to bring shame to the family name. Olga asked Cárcel if he didn't agree. He replied in a cold and indifferent tone that he wasn't sure what she wanted him to say. Seeing how he reacted, the Duchess wanted to know if he was worried Inés might be upset by her words. But that girl there always ignores her mother, so you don't need to worry. However, Cárcel defended his wife, threatening to follow Inés's example and also ignore the Duchess if she planned to continue making those comments in the future. The Duchess asked hesitantly what he meant by those comments, and that surely he didn't mean the words she spoke in concern for his wife. He said that concern is based on affection. If she truly loved her daughter, she would be more afraid of hurting her than of some words of contempt. Cárcel, who stood up without realizing it, reached out his hand to Inés as he finished saying his wife has ears, so she can hear everything said. Inés stared at him for a moment before looking at Duke Valestena, who immediately nodded as if he would be grateful if Cárcel left quickly. When Inés rose from her chair and stood beside him, Cárcel gave a slightly perfect bow and announced that the trip to Castello would be long, so he hoped they would forgive them for not staying longer. The Duke and Duchess looked at them confused as if they knew nothing beforehand. Shortly after, Inés looked at Cárcel, who accompanied her carefully without saying a word. But then he opened his mouth and said that no normal mother would have such a low opinion of her daughter, nor would she shame her in front of her own husband. To be fair, Inés said her mother was quite excited about the marriage. If he had let her finish speaking, he would have found out she was just relieved her fears hadn't materialized. Furthermore, what he saw today doesn't happen all the time. Her father resides on an estate in Mendoza, while Olga stayed in Perez, so the whole family was rarely together as they were that day. But as Inés simply started to ignore everything, Cárcel commented he could tell she had gone through this kind of thing countless times before. Regardless of whether she is a Valestena or an Escalante, she shouldn't have let her mother speak that way. Suddenly, he began to mention something else and hesitantly apologized. She questioned for what. He replied he didn't want to press her like that. Inés didn't understand what he meant and asked him to explain. He said he acted like an animal last night, and now that he thought about it, he was no different from her mother, since he treated her without care, and it was understandable that she was tired of him after what happened. Inés remained in silence, observing, mentally wondering if he was still worried about what was said yesterday. Actually, Cárcel hadn't forced her last night. It was obvious he was controlling his desires instead of simply continuing with force. This showed her that contrary to his perverted nature, he did his best to fulfill his obligations. Of course, he fulfilled that obligation quite intensely. Inés commented that he hadn't treated her badly, as the previous night had been the wedding night and they were just fulfilling their duties as a couple. Of course, given her strangeness, she was sure it wasn't enough for him. Inés had made sure not to satisfy him completely, acting not too shy, otherwise it could have delayed things. After all, it would become a problem if she didn't get pregnant in the future, so she thought she managed to pull it off half and half at least. However, to Cárcel, she wasn't strange in the least. In fact, her performance exceeded his expectations in many ways. He recounted how she sat and climbed on his banana while they were in the bathtub until 2 hours ago, even after doing it intensely all night. It was truly incredible. Not to mention, she sucked every last drop. At that moment, Inés interrupted, saying this wasn't something they should be discussing outside the room. He said they merely performed their duties as a couple, and were now talking as any other couple should. Furthermore, a couple's duties end in 10 minutes, but their first night lasted more than 10 hours. Suddenly, Inés's body slumped as she misstepped. Cárcel caught her firmly in his arms and began to carry her up the stairs. She was in shock for a moment but instinctively seemed aware of the looks from their staff. When she focused her gaze on them, the flushed and glowing faces of the young maids made her embarrassed. Inés whispered that she hated things like this and asked him to put her down, but Cárcel was so content he promptly refused. She asked once more for him to put her down, calling her husband by name. He smiled as he continued to carry her in his arms, and replied she had finally discovered the utility of using his first name. Inés refuted that it still didn't seem to be of much help. By early evening, the carriage finally reached its destination. As soon as Inés stepped out, she checked the time on her pocket watch and realized it had been 7 hours since they had left the Valestena residence. She complained that they hadn't even done anything and were still 2 hours late. But for Cárcel, it wasn't true they did nothing. He reminded her she slept in his lap the whole trip. Inés said she still couldn't believe he asked the carriage to slow down just for that. Changing the subject, she hadn't expected to accompany him to his post. She was thinking that when he returned to work, she would go to the Duchy of Esposa. Cárcel muttered that he wouldn't be there. She tried to put it into his head that they didn't have to be together all the time now that they were married. Most officers don't live with their wives. On the contrary, they stay at their posts while their wives look after official residences in the capital. It was common for these couples to spend only brief vacations together, but Castella was an exception. Even those couples who married without love live together here since the city is so attractive. The coast of Castella is surrounded by mountains and receives the sea breeze directly. Unlike Mendoza, where the air is hot and humid, the sound of the sea waves could be heard here. If it weren't for the social expansion in Mendoza, everyone would choose to live in this beautiful military port. The unique rigidity of the massive naval port, its imposing skies, and the way the beautiful ocean blends with the city in a harmoniously strange way. Besides the sound of the waves, these things would always remind Inés of a certain person from her dreams. She could hear the aggressive sound of the waves from the port and saw the instability of her vision. And with each difficult breath, her hands shook as if they would at any moment, with the restlessness that she would soon lose. It wasn't the best time to remember. They had had better moments. Suddenly, Cárcel called for her, making Inés suddenly return to reality. She wrapped her hand around Cárcel's arm, replying she was fine and asking them to go inside. However, she couldn't take her eyes off him because in that past life, on that dramatic day, she wanted to know why he did that. The port they were at that day was not Castella, but a small fishing port located at the far end of the coastline. The naval port was situated just above the main port and was not a place where civilians were allowed to walk freely. But on that day she was fleeing with Emiliano, the moment Cárcel spotted 2 civilians boarding a clandestine boat, he let them escape. That was why she wanted to know what he was doing there that day, and why he helped Emiliano. 2 weeks ago, Cárcel had a conversation with Major Elba regarding the former Escalante official residence. The Major asked if that was really all he wanted in exchange. Cárcel replied yes and made sure to prepare the item he had mentioned earlier. Elba still couldn't believe it, even while looking at it right now, thinking that he would try to bribe his superior with something like that. But he had no choice but to see him in a different light. Suddenly he began to cry while declaring he was very moved by what he did for him, and thanked Cárcel for such an honored gift. He said the musket and a baton with Admiral Calderon's name engraved were not gifts money could buy. Cárcel said he was aware of how much the Major respected his grandfather, but was concerned that only his handwritten letter would be enough for the Major's wife. While kissing the musket, Elba replied movingly that, of course it would be. But he was surprised how someone like Cárcel, whose residence was quite small, not to mention he never had an interest in houses facing the sea, seemed tired of the sea. Cárcel looked down and replied that he would soon be married and would soon be the husband. Back to the present, Inés didn't seem excited about the new residence. In fact, she wanted to know why he had so much luggage. The residence was so small for so many things that she asked if there would be enough space left for her. Cárcel ended up mixing his thoughts with his words and replied to his wife, maybe not, instead of asking why there wouldn't be enough space. But leaving his blunders aside, Inés commented it didn't seem like there would be space for her things either, since they hadn't arrived from the Valestina residence yet. She murmured uncomfortably that this might be normal. since it's rare for soldiers to live with their families at their posts, but still it was a bit much. The words he heard from Inés made Cárcel remember a conversation he heard from his Navy companions a while ago. The man with a cigar in his mouth described how as soon as he started living with his wife, she became a completely different person. It was as if she were a woman he was meeting for the first time. He speculated it was due to all the time they spent together. And since they didn't have many servants at home, she became so much gentler now that he could hardly remember why they fought before. Suddenly, the housekeeper appeared. Her name was Rhonda. She warned that Inés's stay would be perfectly comfortable and asked if she didn't want to start by throwing away everything she didn't like. Except for the lieutenant, of course. While Rhonda spoke and smiled gently, Inés stared at Cárcel and declared that even being her husband, she didn't want to throw away someone else's things. Then the housekeeper began to show the house. First, she took them to the game room where there was a pool table, chessboard, and cards. She said he used this room to enjoy himself alone, which made Inés ask him with a mischievous smile if he liked being alone. Cárcel asked her not to speak in a way that made him sound antisocial. Giving up on explaining the matter, Cárcel carried her to another room. And the moment he opened the door, the sight left her speechless for an instant, before he finally opened his mouth and said this was their room. It was a room even more magnificent than the bridal chamber where they spent their first night together. Seeing the garden beyond the window where leaves glistened under the touch of the sun, Inés was dazzled by the simple yet cozy and intense beauty. She examined the place carefully, every corner and every detail, until she reached the balcony and lost herself in the beautiful view of the sea before her. She seemed lost in the moment, absorbing the tranquility of the place while the soft wind played with her long, dark hair. Suddenly, she turned upon hearing the maid ask her to accompany her because she wanted to show the last room. The maid took her to a library. Personally, she never saw the lieutenant read anything, so perhaps this could become Lady Inés's own private library. Furthermore, from the library, she could see the ocean and the naval residences on the hill. After showing all the places, Rhonda asked what she thought, and if it was to her liking. Cárcel also wanted to know what his wife thought of the place, his eyes fixed on her, waiting for her answer in silence. After observing the beauty and simplicity of the location, Inés smiled inwardly and replied she loved the place, making Cárcel feel relieved. She liked it. Later, Inés and Cárcel were on the balcony contemplating the garden lit by small lights. She asked how his vacation was already ending tomorrow, and he, with an almost provocative smile, questioned if she was disappointed. Actually, she was impressed by his lack of planning. He tried to defend himself, saying he planned things very well, but she asked if he was talking about the plan he made where he only had 2 weeks of vacation, even after using all his available leave. He commented that thanks to that, the wedding occurred without problems, and she was there with him now, so he saw no problem. Suddenly, he looked at Inés. Upon hearing her confess, she was relieved. Silence fell between them for a few seconds until she spoke that this place was quite different from what she thought. She thought it would be more like a port, perhaps more tumultuous and noisy, crowded with fishing boats. Cárcel explained this place was a military base where fishing is banned, but if she went down the coast a bit, there was a famous port there. In Mendoza, people call it Puerto Castella, but residents call it Puerto El Tabel. That is the main port. When he finished speaking, Inés remained in silence for a moment without saying anything. She rose slowly and went back inside the room, while Cárcel also rose to accompany her. Inés walked to the interior of the room and stopped before a painting on the wall. She began to speak in almost a whisper, asking if this place was also El Tabel. He shook his head and replied with a pensive tone that that was one of the smaller ports. If he wasn't mistaken, the name was Sevilla. Cárcel asked if she liked the painting. If she wanted, he could put it in her library. However, Inés responded immediately, no. Before he could ask why, she spoke in a firm tone that she didn't like it in the least, and asked him please to throw it away because she never wanted to have to see it again. The next day, the first rays of sun entered through the window, revealing Inés and Cárcel sleeping together in a spoon position. She slowly opened her eyes, feeling how suffocating it was to be hugged by him like that. While trying to understand her situation, she wondered how she ended up there. She remembered having sat near the window last night, opening a Bible in search of something that would bring her calm. However, the mood began to heat up, and she ended up carried away by the atmosphere and blacked out right there. Inés observed him for an instant, thinking it was no wonder he was a famous womanizer. But she was sure they were only fulfilling their obligations, and he was probably just excited because it was the honeymoon. She didn't know how long he would be able to ignore his need to find another woman for the bed. Even true love eventually cools, so she doubted a desire born of obligations would last forever. Inés convinced herself this was only temporary and let her mind wander away from that moment. She felt the cold morning air with its refreshing wind and the curtains swaying to the gentle sound of waves. She was sure these things could be heard in Sevilla too. When Inés woke again in her 6-year-old body, Sevilla was the place that controlled her like a nightmare. It was the place that made her spend years hating Luciano, who had once again become a young man. This kept her trapped within those memories of the first time she met Emiliano at 16, until he died at 20. It also reminded her of the night Emiliano's body turned cold and her baby was stolen from her. She used to wake up every morning with the certainty that that terrible date was approaching, that the night of Emiliano's death would be coming. The memories of Sevilla, the ocean, and everything it represented to her came accompanied by a sadness that had never left. But now, while the sun entered through the window and the name that only yesterday had resurfaced in her life no longer carried the same power, she no longer looks at the ocean and dreams of Sevilla or Emiliano. Now she merely lies in the arms of another man and thinks about these things. She closed her eyes a moment to feel the soft light of dawn illuminating and warming her face, and as the weight of those memories dissipated, Inés slowly opened her eyes, because she knows that in this life, none of these things have happened yet. Involved by Cárcel's warm, large arms, she turned and gently bumped her forehead against his chest. She whispered in a low voice that he needed to wake up, for the day had already dawned. Short time later, Cárcel returned to his workplace. The sound of footsteps echoed through the corridors, and the curious looks of the officers accompanied every movement. One of the soldiers, noticing Cárcel's expression, seemed not to believe what he was seeing. "The lieutenant is smiling," he said, as if that had never happened before. Cárcel repeated the name Cárcel Escalante several times in his mind, while whispers and murmurs began to echo among those present. While the surprise was impossible to hide, the reactions were of pure panic. Bets had apparently been made on how he would react to marriage. Some had bet he would have a vacant expression. Others believed he would show nothing but coldness. But no one expected to see him with such an evident smile. Some speculated he was smiling to avoid crying, while others believed it was a sign of resignation before an inevitable situation. However, another quickly commented he was no longer smiling. He looked irritated now. Behind him, other soldiers also began to judge his behavior, speculating it was clearly a perverted smile. Another spoke that he heard Lady Escalante was not that kind of wife. He heard she was an especially pure woman. When a novice spoke that her husband was not the least bit pure, Cárcel slapped the back of his head, making the boy abruptly change the subject and ask how it felt to be married. Finally, the group fell silent to hear the answer. Everyone stared with expectation, but contrary to what everyone expected, the answer came in an unexpectedly positive tone, with Cárcel smiling and saying it was very good. The group was perplexed, not fully understanding what that meant, but all seemed to agree among themselves that he wanted to change the subject. Visibly uncomfortable with the intrusion into his personal life, Cárcel ordered them to stop that immediately. However, Lieutenant Acevedo didn't stop there. He mentioned that all those rumors were completely false, referring to the absurd stories about Inés being a witch or a dangerous figure. As the conversation continued, Cárcel distanced himself in silence, reflecting that he already expected this, but it was so irritating. Lieutenant Acevedo told the others that actually she was far more beautiful than anyone expected. That was why he bet Cárcel would appear smiling like a pervert. The novice soldier asked if he was saying Lieutenant Cárcel smiled like that because he was a pervert. He replied that he surely had a wild first night with his wife. Cárcel and Inés? Focalizing would only bring more headaches. So he turned and walked to his office. Already in front of his quarters, away from the irritating talk, Cárcel opened the door and once again found the place surrounded by flowers and letters. They are all from women he's had a moment with and others who waited anxiously for a first night. Previously, he didn't mind seeing his office like that every day, but now all of it was suffocating and irritating. He held a red rose, gripping it tightly, and asked himself why all military bases smelled so rotten. Approaching the desk, his eyes fixed on the sealed letters lying there, his hands touched one of them with a wax seal that seemed carefully crafted, when suddenly he heard the sound of a soft knock on the door. His direct subordinate, Jose, informed that Commander Varden was asking when he could pay a visit to his new home. But Cárcel's response was direct and cold, asking him to get lost immediately. The soldier hesitated for a moment before retreating and asking for forgiveness for interrupting him. When alone again, Cárcel walked to a fireplace. His mind seemed to spin around the words and the enthusiasm others showed for his wife. He couldn't help but have this despicable feeling rising up his throat. Looking at the burning letters and each written word begging for attention, Cárcel didn't like a single one of those comments about his wife. Meanwhile, on the balcony of the Escalante estate, the maid approached hesitantly, commenting in a careful tone that it wasn't her business, but everyone was worried if it was okay for Inés to stay inside all day. Inés raised her eyes slowly in confusion. Then the maid continued, informing that clearly the lady must not be pregnant yet, but has spent the days only eating and sleeping. Internally, Inés knew she had been indulging in a routine of laziness, but wondered if she really looked so purposeless. Not to mention Cárcel has been unnecessarily careful every morning, to the point of making her appear even more inactive. Noticing the silence of her lady, Rhonda insisted on saying they were only worried she might be feeling depressed, since it wasn't as bustling as Mendoza and here there wasn't much to see besides the vast ocean, nor was there anywhere to spend money. Inés gently interrupted her, replying she didn't need those things and thinking to herself that living quietly was the best way to rebel in high society. Inés was always so busy in her first life, and the opinion of servants mattered so little that she never considered them. In her second life, she was so poor she couldn't afford any servant. But this life is different. What she needs are witnesses. After all, Inés has to prepare for the beautiful separation of this marriage. A few hours later, Inés's exclusive servant arrived at the residence, observing the house with a look of surprise. He didn't expect the residence to be so simple and so small. She said she should have spoken in advance. In response, Raoul informed her luggage was scheduled to arrive in 5 trips, but for now he brought Inés's most valuable things, so he would put them inside. However, she warned there was no room inside, which caused a shock to Raoul, not wanting to believe that was possible. But she confirmed, saying the place barely had room for Cárcel's things. Originally, Raoul was the loyal servant Inés brought with her to the palace to use like a slave, but now he was just one of the people in her extremely reduced social circle. In her first life, Raoul was a street orphan she saved on impulse and put to work for her until the day of her death. But in this life, she saved him as a calculated move, believing he could be useful someday, but it turned out he wasn't very useful. As a result, she set him aside, but with his decent face and height, he managed to become a servant at a young age. Raoul was able to serve the nobles directly, discover their secrets, and tell Inés directly. He pestered other servants to make sure she had everything she needed, and between the ages of 16 and 20, when she was silently losing herself in memories of Emiliano and her baby, Raoul and Juana did everything to keep her fed and alive. Back to the present, Raoul observed the humble house and asked how she could live in a place like this. Inés replied it was a very good place and she was sure there were people who dreamed of living in places like it. He continued to question her, insisting that simple life didn't suit someone like her. But Inés countered, asking if he couldn't see how much weight she gained just from eating and sleeping well. He laughed and commented that didn't matter when she was already so beautiful, and asked about the Cárcel Escalante, reminding her she promised to take him when she married. She explained she couldn't have more servants in this place. In fact, she should be grateful this place, which was supposed to serve as a temporary residence for officers, was so well looked after. He questioned her, suggesting she leave the lieutenant in charge and return to the castle. With an enigmatic smile, Inés asked why, so that she could bring him with her. He replied without hesitation, yes. In her first life, Inés used him like a slave and couldn't even remember what he became in her second life. Now in her third life, she left him free to be whatever he wanted. And yet he still acted like a dog waiting to be called by his master. Raoul suggested she look at the luggage and select some things she wanted to keep, when suddenly Inés and Raoul's eyes turned to the man who had just arrived at the residence. Cárcel observed the two directly, especially Raoul, while commenting it seemed a guest had arrived. Inés didn't expect him to return so soon. She hadn't even prepared anything. Cárcel responded with a light tone of humor that it wasn't as if she were preparing his meals. She shot back that she would at least be pretending to do something inside the house. The butler waited for Cárcel and observed Inés with a critical look. She could ignore the maid's concerns, but the butler's eyes are different. Inés realized she couldn't continue being the lazy wife. Cárcel mentioned he skipped training today. She asked if he didn't train every day. He admitted he was lazy by nature, so he couldn't afford to go so far. When Cárcel began to change clothes without the slightest ceremony, revealing his sculpted physique, the sight made Inés freeze for an instant, her gaze fixed on him. This brought memories to Inés's mind of a time when she was tired of hearing Cárcel's name after constantly hearing women praise him based on his appearance. In those days, they used to talk about how his angelic face was not his greatest triumph. They believed it was actually his chest and back that he had worked hard to get that way. Inés remembered those times when staying quietly in a salon was one of her greatest pleasures. But those days were gone, and now only the protagonist of those stories remained. There was no one to gossip about the two. only them there in Castella. Inés realized he was changing clothes alone, so she asked if he needed help, but was soon surprised when he replied that if she touched him now, it wouldn't end with him just lowering his pants. When the butler retreated from the room, Cárcel asked if she was trying to compensate for dinner not being ready. She replied by asking if she was that transparent. He commented it wasn't, why, guessing was much easier. He knew at least that much after 17 years. Inés couldn't help but smile and said in an unpretentious tone that she was offering since she hadn't prepared any meal for him. It was such an easy task to do that she didn't want to ruin everything. Cárcel looked at her with intensity and questioned if she was compensating by watching him change like a pervert. She replied wanting to know how helping to change clothes made her a pervert. Cárcel confessed that for a moment he almost lost control over his impulses, and not thanks to that look she was giving him. Inés retreated instinctively, but he moved faster, pulling her close in an agile movement and commenting he never said he was going to jump on her, so why was she pulling away so fast? Cárcel whispered close to her ear that he had said he almost lost control, not that he actually did. Furthermore, he guessed she was quite interested since she snuck in here. Retreating slightly, Inés replied she would think if she made his joy after she ate first. When suddenly the maid saw the couple's intimate moment and quickly bowed, she smiled elegantly at the servant, which made Cárcel wonder why she was smiling. As soon as the maid left, Inés warned him he needed to act with dignity inside his house, because talking about losing control in the middle of the hallway was shameful. But he replied with a casual tone that if she continued talking about it, it was quite likely he would lose control indeed. He reminded her Escalante was married now, so it was time to grow up. Cárcel commented quickly that she was an Escalante too, and when she talked like that, it was impossible to tell who she was talking about. He squeezed her waist while Inés mentioned he looked different today. Before Cárcel could respond or provoke her further, footsteps retreated from the stairs when Raúl reached the hallway. He stopped abruptly upon witnessing the two together. Cárcel remained calm while Inés seemed surprised by Raúl's unexpected arrival. Upon meeting him, Inés became clearly uncomfortable. In her past lives, she was fed by Raúl when she was a child. To her, Raúl was like family. Inés pushed Cárcel back and asked if he had dinner yet, while imagining that this was almost like being caught by Luciano while in the arms of another man, even if that man was her legitimate husband. Cárcel watched them for a moment. He couldn't understand why she acted that way. The only thing he could do was speculate, but no speculation was pleasant. A few minutes later in the dining room, Cárcel commented that every time that fellow was around, she acted as if suddenly blind to everything else. Inés asked if the boy did something wrong. He replied by asking if that was how she usually called him. She explained yes. Even being a servant, he looked after her since they were children and was always loyal. To explain how Raúl served her with devotion and loyalty, Inés would first have to explain why such loyalty was necessary and describe how broken she was before. But this is not a story Cárcel has to hear. Cárcel commented that she spoke as if he were a puppy she raised at home. She replied he was nothing like a dog. Cárcel mentioned she should know she had a gift for describing men as dogs. She shook her head in denial, explaining that wasn't her intention and he was not a dog, and asked what was bothering him so much. Cárcel declared he was, but didn't know why. Perhaps he just didn't like today's guest. Inés warned he was a Valestena servant. He only came here to bring her belongings. Cárcel tried his best to suppress the discontent on his face, but couldn't help asking if she was disappointed he returned home early today, and asked what he meant by that. He presumed he had interrupted a reunion. She confirmed they were quite close. Raúl was surprisingly skilled, intelligent, and perceptive to the needs of the noble class. Cárcel ended the conversation immediately, stating he already understood he was amazing. But Inés took advantage that he entered that subject and asked if it would be okay for him if she talked with Raúl a little more after dinner. Cárcel was surprised she bothered to ask, but didn't show the surprise on his face and questioned why she was asking him permission. She didn't hesitate to declare that Cárcel was her husband and Raúl was a man. She had nothing to hide, and Raúl was just a Valestina employee. But since they would be meeting late at night and Cárcel said he didn't remember him, the least she could do was ask permission from her husband. She explained she liked doing things correctly and that he needed to keep that in mind from now on. So after finishing speaking, Inés went back to eating the delicious food the head chef had prepared for them. Cárcel looked at her for a few moments and turned away. He was trapped between feelings of embarrassment and annoyance, but his face showed he was more embarrassed than annoyed. Raúl had arrived in the early afternoon, and the clock had just struck 8, but his presence had irritated Cárcel more than once. Right now, he is irritated seeing Inés and Raúl talking in the garden. Cárcel knows he can't even compare to him, but his sophistication and good looks are things even nobles would probably consider advantageous. But even with all those qualities, that servant wouldn't be able to seduce Inés. Inés Velestena only cared about appearances. That was why she became Inés Escalante at age 6. She arrogantly pointed her finger at him, and from that moment on, it became clear she had exceptionally high standards when it came to appearance. Their wedding night might have been Inés's first time, but it didn't seem as if she knew nothing regarding men. Despite that shy way of acting she put on, there were things she couldn't hide. After all, that night was a very long one. He wouldn't care if she had 10 or even 20 men in her past. 10 would be better than 1, and 20 would be even better than 10. But 1 would be the worst number. To think that it was one man who managed to tear down the wall she places around herself. Cárcel gets excited just by being near her. So how could he win? He cursed himself in humiliation for his own feelings for putting himself in the position of a rival against a servant. The way Raoul calls her with such familiarity must come from the long time they spent together. Meanwhile, there has been nothing between Cárcel and Inés in these 17 years. She had already brought him so many horrible emotions in his dreams that he had forgotten about them for a while. But those miserable feelings are returning to Cárcel now. Despite what he feels, Inés is there with him, and he knows that he is her type. Cárcel knows this, but even so, he still doesn't like it. Later, Inés's hair was being pulled with a brush by an inexperienced maid. The maid began to panic, explaining quickly that she had only done manual labor before and couldn't control her strength. With a calm voice contrasting with the young woman's desperate expression, Inés asked her to go rest and said she would do it herself. But the moment the maid was about to withdraw, she was startled to encounter Cárcel. She quickly ran from the room, which left Cárcel confused by the scene. He turned and then frowned at Inés in the mirror. When he saw the hairbrush and a knot in her hair, he quickly figured out what had happened. Cárcel mentioned that he had already told her to hire a maid, and Inés replied that she can still find one in Mendoza, but he informed her that they are going to stay in Castella for a while. She commented that they don't have a room to hire another person. Cárcel said they can always let someone go and leave a room free for a maid, but he can't send the cook away because the food is too good. Inés smiled and reminded him that he was never one to complain as long as there is meat on the table. But today's food, the ox was nearly lowing for being so rare. However, Cárcel explained that this is part of the technique. It has to be prepared so that it is perfectly seared on the outside and soft on the inside. While speaking, Cárcel leaned forward and took the hairbrush still stuck in Inés's hair. He fumbled awkwardly to untangle the knot, while Inés laughed at the sight. She asked if the hair oil isn't helping. Cárcel grumbled that no, it isn't, and that they really need to hire a maid or bring Juana here. Inés informed him that Juana is going to get married in Perez. She has a man she is in love with there, and even if she brought him too, the place is too small to host even a pet. Cárcel fell silent and focused on untying the knot in Inés's hair while she looked at him out of the corner of her eye, reflecting that she is always impressed by his face, even when he is doing something ridiculous. He manages to look more cute than pathetic. She understood this on a theoretical level, even if she didn't connect emotionally with these observations. Unlike most women, Inés was no longer easily influenced by emotions and did not trust her instinct. After all, her instincts had led her to Oscar, who was a useless vagabond, and then to Emiliano, who was a poor orphan and just a painter's assistant. Just as Oscar's position was not enough to compensate for his depraved lifestyle, Emiliano's love and devotion were not enough to compensate for her miserable reality. When the knot finally came undone, Inés commented in a slightly ironic tone that his skills are good, but Cárcel ignored his wife's ironic comment and asked where his compensation was. While she wondered what he meant, Cárcel gently slid his hands from Inés's shoulders until one hand grabbed one of her breasts and squeezed it, and the other slid lower to her waist. Cárcel bit Inés's neck, making her let out a light cry of pleasurable pain. With gentle pressure, he squeezed her breasts with his hands, which made Inés start to feel her body getting hotter with every touch, every bite, and kiss on her neck. He continued playing with her breasts, squeezing and releasing them repeatedly, until finally, he slid the strap of her robe down and left them exposed in the mirror. A slight wave of embarrassment colored her cheeks, but she was not overcome by shyness. She even suggested that they go to bed. However, Cárcel, biting her ear gently, whispered that he likes it there. She confessed that she also thinks it's time to do it again, but when she tried to explain something, he interrupted her, asking if she hates being in front of the mirror. Inés declared that she doesn't want to do it like this. If it helps him get a little more excited, fine, but it doesn't work for her. Cárcel smiled smugly, willing to check if it's really true, and wanting to see with his own eyes if it truly doesn't work for her. Inés held back another unwanted sound from her mouth and turned to face him. But before she could ask what he wants to verify, in the blink of an eye, Inés was lifted into the air and placed on the dressing table facing him. Cárcel lifted her chemise and lowered himself to place his face between Inés's legs. She almost let out a scream, but caught herself in time. Despite her best efforts to maintain her dignity, she knew she had little dignity left to speak of, waiting with her legs spread for Cárcel to devour her. Inés grabbed Cárcel's hair and pulled his head up to meet her gaze. She expected a malicious or teasing smile, but his cold expression revealed nothing. Slightly threatened, Inés slowly released Cárcel's hair from her grip, but he grabbed her hand firmly. Cárcel continued kissing her palms as if Inés's hands were his substitute for her lips, since he had no access to kiss her on the mouth. Seeing him shower kisses all over her hand was even more embarrassing than having his head between her legs. While Cárcel pushed into her with force, Inés tried to speak amidst the sounds of pleasure from her mouth that it's very bad there, but he continued to provoke her, asking her to look at how good she looks in the mirror. Even if she wants to admit that her body doesn't feel pleasure from his actions, with her legs trembling and that expression on her face, the truth is too obvious to pretend otherwise. Cárcel tilted Inés's chin with his hand and asked her to look at how crazy with pleasure she is, and he also thinks she can feel her trembling legs very well. He whispered that at this rate, she's going to end up wetting the whole floor and they will slip. While he pushed deeper, he asked if she wants to give birth to their child. If that's what she desires so much, Cárcel is going to take her properly and fulfill the duty she talks about so much. But if she goes crazy like this every time, that sense of duty of hers will end up being broken. Inés shouted that it's too intense and asked him to go slower, but he said that this way, going deeper and deeper into her, she won't need to keep looking at his face. Cárcel commented that he's going to keep doing it in this position for that noble duty she has craved since their first night together. He lifted her chin and declared that he respects her will, but he doesn't want to fulfill her perverted desires. The next day, Inés was sprawled on the bed, feeling a small pain in the lower part of her stomach and reflecting that something must have malfunctioned in his head after the wedding night. Or else he truly went mad. She doesn't understand what it is about her that leaves him like this. They renounced the formalities they had to fulfill in Mendoza, and she is still wearing the same boring black dresses. And no makeup. Inés wonders if there is something special about her appearance that excites a man all this time, and she hasn't been abandoned by him yet. All her cooperation so far was simply for her own plan. On the outside, she should be behaving like a woman who was long in love with an unrequited love. She even acted as if she were desperate for this marriage to happen despite Cárcel's opposition. Inés is the woman without pride who married a man in the blink of an eye despite his proposal being made suddenly. For a woman like that, this honeymoon should be a dream come true. She is certain that sleeping with him every time he wanted was the right decision. Now she just needs to slowly decrease the frequency. The plan was always that she would ask to sleep with him and he would refuse. Despite that not happening now, she is certain that is the direction their marriage is taking. Cárcel will eventually lose interest and any affection he has for her, and thus their marriage will end in divorce. Then Inés will finally manage to have true freedom, and with that, Inés's true death will be waiting for her at the end of this life. At age 10, Inés convinced a lawyer to tell her everything about divorces and cases where employee testimony was accepted. The man said there were cases where both husband and wife paid their employees before the trial, but a small slip by a single employee led the judge to assume that the testimony of all the others was bought. There was also another case with an interesting twist. One of the parties paid an employee, but the employee ended up giving the opposite testimony of what they should. Things like that can happen if the employee holds hatred for their employer or if they suffered unfair treatment in the past. A famous example of this is the case of Duchess Katia. She was always so kind that her reputation inside the mansion was excellent. Because of that, despite the fact that there was clear evidence she committed adultery just like her husband, she ended up receiving a more favorable verdict than his. After hearing about all the cases the lawyer mentioned, Inés reached the conclusion that building a good reputation over time is important, and that is what she must do to have the employees on her side in this divorce. To have a reputation built over time, the employees must never know they are being bought. In fact, she must not try to buy all of them. However, nothing went as Inés planned. In a conversation with a maid, Inés had asked if she was being paid enough to do her service, mentioning afterward that she can make any adjustments she needs. But the young woman replied that what they are paying is more than enough. In fact, she is sure she is being paid even too much. Practically everyone wants to work at the lieutenant's residence because Lord Cárcel is very generous with his employees. Inés really wasn't expecting that answer. She intended to increase the salaries of some maids to use them as witnesses for her divorce, but at the first step, her plan was already ruined. Suddenly, the maid commented that everyone is happy that Lord Cárcel finally found his life partner. Upon hearing what she said, Inés wavered for a moment. Then she pushed a plate of cookies toward the maid. The girl started drooling while at the same time refusing to eat such an expensive dish. But Inés replied that she must be starving. So she asked her to eat some and also said she has a favor to ask her. The maid responded immediately that she will do anything. So she reached the conclusion that even if they are being well paid, free food still works. She knows how difficult it is not to have favorable feelings towards someone so generous. Money can buy anything in this world. The best thing would be to find out how they are being paid, but even if she knows, it won't be very good because they might mistake her for being an arrogant noble who doesn't understand their humble way of living. But of course she knows what poverty is like. Her life with Emiliana was a very clear definition of what poverty is. But it wasn't enough for her to understand the life of a normal commoner. Now on the balcony, Inés asked the butler Alfonso if the coachman had already returned home. Currently, she knows that the gardener is busy cutting the branches of the trees, but she doesn't know about the other servants. Alfonso replied that they usually have lunch at this time, and the head maid Rhonda asked curiously the reason the lady was looking for them. Inés commented that she was being very negligent after being thrown into a strange place, and all this time she had been spending the days feeling isolated. She only realized later that actually it was she who was closing her heart to everyone around. Rhonda approached her lady emotionally, while Inés continued saying that until now she never really realized how much the two of them cared for her. When suddenly she rested her gaze on the butler with the objective of analyzing his reaction. Every time she meets the butler's eyes, he gives the impression of being a very stubborn man. He might already be disappointed in her for having been lazy until now, and yet she cannot figure out what he is thinking. But Inés knows it's okay because if she creates the right atmosphere, it shouldn't be difficult to make most of them start to like her. From now on, creating the right atmosphere in this house will be her mission. Cárcel returned home in the early evening. When he entered the entrance, he noticed how different the house looked from when he left it in the morning. In fact, the change was still underway. The maids and servants were running through the house with furniture or trinkets in their arms. They were so preoccupied with what they were doing that they didn't even notice their master's arrival. Suddenly, someone ran toward him while calling him happily. When he turned, he realized it was Inés moving with a speed he had never seen her use before. But the hardest part to believe was that she had a smile on her face and was wearing clothes that weren't. Cárcel was stunned for a moment. He could hardly believe his own eyes, wondering why she is looking like a normal wife welcoming her husband. When she spoke affectionate words that normal wives do, Cárcel realized that even her voice is so kind, almost as if her soul had been swapped. And when Inés saw that Cárcel was still standing in the doorway, she pulled her husband and asked him to enter. Still not believing what he was seeing, he asked what all this is that is happening. She replied that she was wanting to organize the house because, as he knows, she has been a bit unmotivated since arriving in Castella. As far as Cárcel remembered, Inés was far from being depressed or unmotivated. On the contrary, she always seemed perfectly content in her stubborn laziness. Cárcel admitted that he thought Inés was quite lovely in the morning. As impossible as it was to match Inés Valestena to such a word, Inés Escalante was lovely when she was only half conscious. Suddenly, she said she realized something this morning. She realized that she needs to put everything in its proper place. Her voice was so inflexible that Cárcel wondered if she also planned to put him back in his proper place. After all, last night he played a lot with her breasts and even buried his head between her legs to kiss and devour the preciousness. But in fact, it was nothing like what he was thinking. Inés had said that she decided to throw some things away that no longer had uses, so that is why the house is this mess now. Cárcel began to go down the hallway. Inés noticed him moving and quickly followed him and put her arm around his. She then hugged his arm and leaned closer, showing a pained smile to him. Immediately, Cárcel's brain stopped working for a moment, wondering what the hell is going on. Even when she was a child, Inés never forced herself to smile for anyone, not for the crown prince or even for other members of the imperial family. In a way, she was fair in the way she treated everyone equally and delicately. That is why this moment makes no sense at all. Cárcel looked closely at Inés, remembering that Oscar once said that Inés was born to be of the ruling class. Even among the aristocracy, Inés was exceptionally suited to give orders to people. Now that he thinks about it, she and Oscar could form a good pair. But Cárcel quickly pushed the frustrating scenario out of his head. Then he looked at her again, who left behind a trail of fragrance wherever she went. Although Inés always smelled good, this smell was too artificial to be anything other than a perfume. It was a lady thing, but something different from Inez. Carcel began to wonder if she sat in front of the mirror and thought about what they did that night, when suddenly Inez commented that she is worried about the fact that everyone in this residence is working too hard. She spoke out loud that everyone must be exhausted, and yet they do everything without complaining at all. And look how meticulous they are with their duties. At that moment, Carcel realized Inez's intentions. He wasn't sure of her true goal, but of one thing he was certain. Inez hadn't cared about him one bit so far. Her kindness is being directed exclusively to the hardworking employees. In fact, the consideration she showed just now was merely an act she put on for them. It wasn't for him. Suddenly, Carcel woke from his trance when the butler commented that the lieutenant seems to have worked hard trying to study the lady's expressions since early on. He realized that he was already sitting at the dinner table facing Inés and Alfonso. And without minding repeating what she had said, Inés said she was asking what Carcel thinks about remaking the fence around the house. He apologized and then mentioned that he was just lost in thought, wondering what her motives are for behaving like this recently. So he would like to know why she is acting this way. Everything she is trying to do, but he just can't understand why she is doing all this out of nowhere. She replied that she is just trying to take care of their house. This is for the two of them and for their guests as well. She emphasized that she needs to leave this house tidy if they want to have guests here, which made Carcel quickly question what guests she is talking about, if she herself doesn't even know anyone in Castella to invite. She replied that she doesn't, but he does. So they need the house to be presentable for their guests. Once Inés announced her intentions, she usually got what she wanted. Thus, Carcel found himself sitting across from José Almenara, who looked uncomfortable sitting at the dinner table in front of his commander. Inés was the only one who seemed happy at the table. She then asked the guest how the food is. José approved of the soup and said, stuttering, that it's cold, but quickly added that he loved it because it's something so different, unique. However, seeing Carcel look at him with his usual distaste, José shrank even more in shame. Inés noticed that he looked pale, so she asked him to take a sip of water. He replied that it was a good idea, but in his thoughts, the poor man just wanted to escape from there right now. José Almenara, being the third son of Count Almenara, was surprisingly a simple man, naturally shy and modest at the same time. He almost became Inés's stepson in her second life. When she lost Emiliano and had her son taken, Inés was taken to Empress Cayetana and had her judgment. Although she had become damaged goods for having a child by a commoner, Inés was still a noble, daughter of House Velistena. So if she admitted her faults and became a faithful wife to an older man as the second wife of Count Almenara, the Empress was willing to forgive her. Inés looked at José and thought that the military academy must have ruined the self-esteem of many young men. She also thought that José's low confidence must be due to his commander, since Carcel's self-esteem was not affected by the 3 years he spent in military school. She asked if Carcel usually bullies him. He quickly replied no, but that answer was not enough for Inés, who turned to Carcel and questioned what he did to this man that he is denying so vehemently. Carcel said she got it all wrong. This bastard has no idea of the comfortable life he has in the Navy. She became furious and asked if he just cursed their guest. José's gaze traveled between Inés and Carcel while they fought because of him. Carcel ordered his subordinate to explain to her that he was never bullied, but Inés retorted that Carcel should apologize before wanting an explanation. José realized that their conversation was decidedly strange. Inés and Carcel seemed less like a newlywed couple and more like a mother scolding a child. He sighed and agreed that he will do what she wants. So he turned to José and said that perhaps he overstepped a bit. José couldn't believe what he heard. However, for Inés, that was not an apology. He should explain exactly what he did wrong. Carcel spat through his teeth that this sucks, then regretted that José had to hear profanities as his guest. But Inés pointed out that he just said profanities, while apologizing for his profanities. He then apologized for cursing again. Meanwhile, José realized that Inés is so different from the rumors. She is not dark like a crow. In fact, she is a beautiful woman who speaks with kindness. Of course, he was forced to use all his vacation this year, but when else would he have the opportunity to receive an apology from the lieutenant? Not to mention the lady is such a pleasant woman. So despite everything, this proved to be a very productive day. Carcel's aunt, Empress Cayetana, was the embodiment of pure ambition, and his father, who had several great goals he worked for throughout his life, could never keep up with his sister. She always suspected that Inés could yield her family's power and take the crown as she herself had done many years ago. That's why she never wanted Inés to marry Oscar. However, despite not liking her, the Empress could not let Inés become a member of another family, because having another family marry into a powerful alliance with the Valestinas would never work. But in the end, the girl who was not good enough for her son but too good to let escape became the fiancée of her nephew, which also worked perfectly. Now Inés was no longer in her way, and all that remained was to use her accordingly. The Empress had the habit of sending them lists of events that the two had to attend, and Inés rejected most of the invitations with the exception of those sent personally by the Empress. But Cárcel still attended every event, just to highlight Inés's absence through the empty seat beside him. According to the Empress, these things showed Duke Valestina's support for the Crown Prince and served as a display of marital unity. But in fact, it was just a way to remind the Duke that there was no going back, as she knew the Duke longed to take his daughter back the moment he had the chance. Cárcel sat on the first-floor terrace and smoked his cigar, reflecting that that's why she was so determined to put the Escalante name on Inés in any way possible. Thinking about it, she must have had a very tiring life being controlled by so many people. While Inés was taking a tour of the house with José, Cárcel wondered why this imbecile hadn't left yet. The two were talking about José's wife who would arrive in Castella soon, and Inés was willing to help her and become her friend. He thanked her and then commented that the officers say that getting married isn't bad because the lieutenant always looks happy in the mornings, which left Inés intrigued. He was sure that Cárcel changed a lot after he got married, and has no doubt that it was the lady who improved the lieutenant's beauty. But for Inés, he is just trying to flatter her with empty words. José made it clear that they are definitely not empty words. Although she was still suspicious, she nodded in agreement and changed the subject, informing that she is going to build a place for games. That way they can have fun together when he visits him again. He asked if the lieutenant would like that, and Inés replied that it would certainly be better than him playing alone while staring at the walls, as it seems he was never close to anyone. Probably because he already knows he's good at being alone. They are treating Cárcel as if he had no socializing skills. That is incredibly humiliating. But for some reason, hearing her ask others to be understanding with him feels as if she were taking care of him as her man. And Cárcel likes that. But when he heard José say more words of flattery to his wife, Cárcel decided he had heard enough and then kicked José out of the residence. Inés was disappointed to learn that Cárcel was never a notorious libertine in Castella. Since José Almenara was Cárcel's closest subordinate and he was clearly too honest to lie without a good reason, she believed him. Inés decided to forget the fruitless dinner. She should have known that Cárcel would have little chance of meeting women in a place like Castella. Even so, she couldn't understand why he rarely attended social events in this place. While pushing deep into her, Inés remained lost in thought, reflecting that he had attended almost all the events in Mendoza. Only today, José told her that he refused several invitations for the two to go to work parties for couples. But Inés would not be defeated so easily. If the opportunity didn't arise naturally, she would create the opportunity for Cárcel to sleep with other women. As soon as Cárcel had the means to meet women, he was bound to start cheating on her at some point. Suddenly, Cárcel opened his mouth and whispered that she is too relaxed. She is even traveling in thought while she is filled with pleasure. Inés's focus returned to the place. She was lazily letting Cárcel move her body with his thrusts, but now she fixed her eyes on him. He slowed his thrusts, narrowed his eyes, wanting to know what she is thinking about. But she replied that it's nothing. So Cárcel pulled entirely out of her while saying that lying is not a virtue. Then he slammed back into her all at once, making the sounds of pleasure from Inés's mouth echo through the room. After reaching the peak twice, she was soaked and her body was totally relaxed. At the same time, Cárcel stared at her and murmured that he feels as if he were being explored by her. Inés pulled him closer to stop him from making such deep and long thrusts and whispered in his ear that she wasn't thinking about anything. But Cárcel questioned if it was about Almenara. Inés almost admitted that she was thinking about him, at least as part of her grand scheme, and asked Cárcel why she would be thinking of José when they are doing this. He replied, questioning the reason she doesn't call him Almenara. After all, the only decent thing about that bastard is his name. She said that's fine, because she didn't care anyway. Cárcel slowly took her arms from his neck and continued entering and leaving Inés's body too fast for her to be able to escape. She then realized that Cárcel was out of his mind, so she decided not to irritate him even more if she wanted to save energy for tomorrow. After all she needs is for some innocent little birds to spread rumors about Cárcel so that she can use them as evidence in the divorce. Even if Inés was moved mainly by self-interest, her motivation now included the smallest touch of care for Cárcel. Perhaps she wants this because she began to get attached to him. At the very least, she does not plan to hurt him. All Inés wanted was to return Cárcel to the life he had before the marriage. Infidelity was hardly a problem in Ortega. Even if the courts declared it a fault, The rest of society couldn't care less. Most couples didn't even bother going through the divorce process, even if they could. In fact, fidelity would be the exception to the rule and would arouse more hushed rumors than one or two lovers. Inés never wanted to do him any harm, and in the end, neither this society nor she will hurt Cárcel, so she will just use him for a while before returning him to his old life. Furthermore, he would be much better off as a divorcee compared to the outcome of his first life when he had no title and was despised for refusing to marry. So what she wanted now is for him to stop interfering in her plans and follow the way she wants. However, Cárcel again interrupted her from her thoughts and stated that she is doing it again. The construction around the residence that had started a few weeks ago is close to finishing, so the sound of hammers outside was no longer heard. The fence was finally perfect, and Cárcel's conservatory was almost ready too. There were only a few problems left to take care of inside the residence, but everything would be ready within 3 to 4 days. Inés watched the curtains swaying in the wind for a few minutes before getting out of bed, and the soundscape of changes reminded her of how much time had passed since she arrived in Castella. In the bright sunlight, she could see the full extent of the damage Cárcel had caused with the many hickeys and bruises. When he washed her last night, he must have continued to suck her, nibble, and more nibbling after she passed out at the end of their intense marital duty. Inés couldn't believe it wasn't enough for him, even after unsettling her like that, leading her to wonder if that was how he spent his nights in the past. But if he were obsessed with every woman he slept with before and left her like this, full of bruises and totally exhausted, Inés was sure there would be rumors about that too. He was certainly promiscuous, but the gossip of his nights was always clean. She understood to a certain extent why Cárcel is frighteningly good in bed. He manages to make her reach the peak countless times every night. However, Inés looked at her body now and was no longer sure that Cárcel was so reasonable in bed. Her skin was full of marks from his possessive lust and desire. She was a wreck. She pushed the image of him from her mind and turned to the rumpled blankets where he had been lying. Fortunately, he had already left the room, and in his place, a breakfast tray was on top of the sheets. She felt a shiver run through her body. The fact that one of the servants entered the room while she was sleeping made her embarrassed, when suddenly the bathroom door opened, and the man who had sucked all her energy entered the room. When Cárcel spotted Inés, his eyes brightened. He was worried because she wasn't waking up. And said to keep worrying since it's all his fault. Cárcel clearly knew this, so that was why he brought breakfast for her so she wouldn't have to go downstairs. Inés thought that of course he should have prepared a meal considering how he tormented her all night. And speaking of last night, she didn't understand why she is the only one who is just a rag, while he seemed so energized. Inés asked him to go down to get his food because she doesn't want to see him for the rest of the day. But he insisted on helping her get dressed, since she can hardly lift her arms, and let out a light smirk upon adding that he knows it's his fault. He stepped away from her apologizing, explaining that he didn't train last night, and this ended up happening, which made Inés look at him confused because she didn't understand how this is related. So Cárcel responded briefly that it is related before going to the nearby table. Inés noticed the food on the table, a steak so rare that the juice dripped at the slightest touch, and some grilled vegetables. It was clearly a meal for Cárcel so that he could have breakfast with his wife, but Inés was worried because Ortegan men never eat in their rooms except those who are mortally ill. Cárcel cut a piece of meat and said that normally he tires himself out on purpose before coming home. Inés was practically speechless. All this time he was supposedly exhausted. Until last night, she had thought he was taking revenge for her being distracted. But the problem is simply her weak stamina. Of course, she knew there was a significant difference between their physiques, but this is already hurting her pride. Feeling irritated and slightly competitive, Inés grabbed her own plate. Unfortunately, she barely had the strength to lift her plate. In fact, all strength had been drained from every limb of her body. Suddenly, Cárcel snatched the plate from her hand effortlessly and placed it on her lap. He said she should have asked him for help because her hands are trembling. Inés almost huffed at his audacity to help and retorted that they are not trembling one bit. Cárcel looked at her with a smile on his face and asked if she wants him to feed her. Inés looked at him with her jaw dropped. Despite the shock, she refused immediately. When she said that him trying to feed her is disgusting, Cárcel took a slice of toast and put it in her mouth while saying that she swallows so well everything he puts in her mouth. Inés was speechless and bit his finger, but he apparently felt no pain. She frowned and bit again, but this time he just laughed. His face was as calm as if a small animal had nibbled his finger, and he still had a smile on his lips when he said she is just like a cat in the way she bites. And he thinks it even makes sense because she has the nervous personality of a cat too. It took a while for Inés to recover from the morning shock. As soon as she recovered, she peered at Cárcel getting dressed in his uniform and murmured that at this rate, she will never have the chance to conceive a child. Indeed, at this rate, her plan would never work. With Cárcel totally satisfied, he would have no motivation to cheat on her. Cárcel looked at her while buttoning his shirt and asked, distractedly, if she said child. Clearly, he hadn't even thought much about the subject until now. Inés tried to hide her irritation by suggesting that they need to establish a routine and choose their nights strategically. He asked what she means when she says strategically. She clarified that she means they should choose nights with the highest probability of her getting pregnant. Cárcel looked at her with bulging eyes and said that this is a provocative topic for so early in the morning. Inés, maintaining her composure, asked him to let her finish before he gets a hard banana again. She explained that they will choose the strategic dates and then establish some ground rules like other couples do. But Cárcel counter-argued, asking if the probability wouldn't be higher if they have relations like yesterday. Daily. Inés responded that he might have the stamina to be so incessant, but she cannot keep up, which made him apologize again. But then he stated that she isn't trying hard enough, since she is trying to take the easy way out instead of trying to increase her chances of pregnancy by trying as much as possible, leaving Inés immediately frustrated with his accusation. She made it clear that she is the one who is putting in the effort here, while he is in it only for the pleasure. However, Cárcel quickly interrupted her, saying that she also seemed to have had plenty of pleasure last night. Inés's mouth was open, but she found no words because she remembered the events of last night too vividly to say anything. Cárcel smiled while buttoning the rest of his shirt and said that if she keeps her mouth open like that, he might be tempted to fill it again. And without giving room for her to complain, he completed saying that he will do what she wants, starting tonight, and asked her to help him fix his collar. She stood on tiptoe and smoothed the creases of his coat. He thanked his beautiful wife for helping him. Of course, she hadn't been much help, but he thanked her anyway and kissed her on top of the head before leaving. She was left alone in the dressing room and murmured to herself that this cannot be a good omen for her. She doesn't like how things are going. A few hours later, Raúl visited the Escalante residence again, but upon seeing his lady's condition, he couldn't help but ask why she lost so much weight. Inés avoided Raúl's gaze. She could hardly say what or who made her overexert herself in recent weeks, so she focused her gaze on the letter she received from her mother. Since she received a letter from her in her past life about her suicide attempt, Inés burned every letter she received. In Inés's first life, her mother tormented her with many of her neuroses, and after the miscarriage she abused her daughter verbally. In this life, after she saw how Inés refused to be under her control, the Duchess became afraid and thus began to discipline her daughter through letters, even though they were living in the same castle. Despite everything, Inés's mother couldn't give up on her because she still loved her as her daughter in her own way. When Inés discovered this, she was so exhausted that she finally gave up resisting after her spontaneous miscarriages in her first life. Her mother said the same things in this letter, that the only responsibility as a wife is to produce an heir, and to think that Inés no longer wants to have a child in this life because of a single letter, but she cannot allow herself to be controlled like this. Inés burned the letter and changed the subject, asking Raúl how the Castle of Esposa is. He replied that the castle looked abandoned and apparently the Duchess Escalante doesn't like Esposa much. She spends most of her time in Mendoza as crown princess and Oscar's aunt. Inés saw the Duchess frequently in her first life but didn't remember the Duchess being memorable. The lack of memory was proof both of Inés's self-absorption and of the quiet nature of Duchess Escalante. Their paths rarely crossed in this life, and Inés intended for it to stay that way. After Raúl explained his entire plan for Inés to take the Castle of Esposa just for herself, even though she made it clear she didn't want it, he changed the subject by remembering that 15 days ago, some news arrived at the Valistena Castle about the young artists Inés is sponsoring. He informed that Madalena began to gain recognition for portrait paintings, and apparently Maria has been in Mendoza working on a single portrait of Countess Gorma all year. And finally, he said that Henry, Garcia, Lourdes, and Emiliano will help restore a painting in a cathedral starting this winter. Inés maintained her calm as if she were talking about any of the other artists. As she swore never to see Emiliano in this life, hearing about his art was the closest she could get to him. She would not allow herself to set eyes on his face but only follow the traces of his life and Raúl's updates. All she wanted was for Emiliano to be financially secure and free to paint as he wished, and for herself to lead a peaceful life. She didn't want to ruin his life or hers again. After Cárcel returned from the barracks, Inés caught him by surprise by announcing that she decided to designate Raúl as the residence's valet. Cárcel was stunned, but Inés gave him no room to argue. She quickly explained that Alfonso is already an elderly butler and yet still does all the work of a servant, so she is hiring Raúl to help him. Cárcel didn't need a servant to look after his trivial tasks. However, Inés needed someone to give orders to because she couldn't simply go around ordering Alfonso as she saw fit. Cárcel observed Raoul's practiced movements and murmured, "If he isn't a bit too young to be a valet." But unfortunately, Cárcel realized Inés was right when she said he is very good at what he does. Even though Cárcel is demonstrating displeasure toward him, Raoul is acting as if he didn't hear or doesn't hear. But when he leaned in and whispered something in Inés's ear, Cárcel thought mentally that this bastard is going to the street right now. After hearing Raoul, Inés recounted that he said he feels as if Cárcel doesn't like him but can't figure out why, which made Cárcel look angrily at the brazen pet, while Inés explained that there's no way that could be true because Cárcel would never hate anyone without reason. Unfortunately, Cárcel knew he had no hope of persuading Inés once she made up her mind, so he was forced to smile and say, "Welcome to the house staff." Later, when Cárcel came out of the shower, Raoul's hand appeared holding a sweatshirt. He hates to admit it, but the boy quickly recognizes what he needs. And after taking the shirt, Cárcel asked where Inés is. Raoul informed him that she is in the library reading the Bible. So he said he wouldn't recommend seeing her now because she always reads the Bible and prays on Thursdays, and she doesn't like interruptions in this established routine. Cárcel had never witnessed Inés doing such a thing, so Raoul advised that it's better not to go to avoid any unnecessary conflict. But Cárcel quickly made it clear that if Inés gets angry with him, that would be his problem, so he won't tolerate any more unsolicited advice. Suddenly, Raoul guaranteed that he would soon be satisfied with his services, just as he had been able to win Lady Inés's trust. With this residence he stole from Commander Elba, he would have much to gain from him as well. When Cárcel was leaving home for work, he called Alfonso and ordered him to hire someone to follow Raoul Ballin. He expected to find out exactly what that dog did by Inés's side all day. The butler laughed upon hearing Cárcel's words. He had finally understood why he was looking at Raoul that way, and quickly apologized as he never thought he would see the day he would be ordered to do something like that. Cárcel set the matter aside for now since Alfonso agreed to carry out his orders, and upon leaving the porch he looked at the gray sky. Dark rain clouds were approaching the coast. Raoul looked through the carriage window. It was raining outside. He had accompanied Inés, who decided to buy some fine wines, but it was a shame that Inés's first visit to El Tabel would be on such a gloomy day. He was worried that his lady would get wet. They could park the carriage as close to the door as possible, but the rain was too heavy and it was impossible for her not to get wet. Inés said there was no need to hurry and decided to wait for the rain to pass. So Raoul took the opportunity to observe his lady. He was worried about her state, but she seemed more relaxed than when she was in Valestena. Raoul cannot deny that this change certainly has something to do with Lieutenant Cárcel. Cárcel might be perfect for Inés as long as his old habits do not return. But knowing his disgusting history, he cannot help but suspect him. So he decided to find something more plausible as bait for Lieutenant Escalante. While Inés and Raoul discussed the event she intended to hold soon, the carriage driver peeked through the window. Later, the driver informed the butler Alfonso that when he peeked inside the carriage, he noticed that Raoul was lost in thought, but Madame Escalante was not saying anything at that moment. He also informed that when they got out of the carriage, Raoul opened the umbrella first, jumped over a puddle of water, and then held Madame Escalante's wrist to steady her on the steps. He offered his foot as a stepping stone to prevent her dress from getting wet, but the lady hated the idea and asked him to stop. Alfonso nodded sternly. That sounded like something she would do. After hearing the driver, Alfonso went to seek information from another employee, but he was only busy admiring Inés and got nothing. So he decided to listen to the maid responsible for cleaning. She said she peeked at Inés and Raoul walking in the garden. He was holding a parasol in one hand while fanning her with the other, but he started sweating so much that Lady Inés herself threw her own handkerchief in his face. The maid started telling exactly everything that occurred. Alfonso even asked her to shorten the report, so she simplified everything, yet it lasted almost 2 hours. The day of the event Inés had planned finally arrived. On the tables, about 20 guests nibbled on dried fruits, exotic cookies, and local foods with their wine. Among the wives of the naval officers, Madame Acevedo asked Inés if she had seen her husband. She replied that Lieutenant Acevedo is in the conservatory. He went there earlier with Commander Barca. Madame Acevedo let out a sigh of contempt. She hopes he isn't cornered into another bet by that commander. But Inés couldn't imagine such refined knights as addicted gamblers. When she saw them in Mendoza, they didn't seem to be that type. The focus shifted to appearance now. Madame Acevedo said her husband looks like an ogre next to Escalante. On the other hand, Inés found him quite masculine. The lady agreed with what she said because he is ugly in the way the men of Ortega are. Then Inés stood up and said she would ask the maids to bring a new dessert. Crown Princess Inés would never have called this gathering a party. At that time, she would have considered the guest list too short and the location too humble. Besides Cárcel, Jose Almenara, and Commander Barca, most of the guests didn't even have a title and were nothing like the popular socialites of Mendoza she had invited to her parties in her distant past. But today's guests were less pretentious and more honest than those she met in Mendoza. She didn't feel as disgusted or repelled by their behavior because she was far from Mendoza and the imperial court of Empress Cayetana. Perhaps the abundance she always desired from life was right here in this small home garden. Inés turned her attention to Carcel in the greenhouse. He was playing cards with Commander Barca, Lieutenant Acevedo, and Lieutenant Salvatore. Carcel looked up to push his golden hair out of his face and met her gaze. His face immediately broke into a wide smile. Inés didn't know how to react. She thought about laughing and waving back, but felt it would be embarrassing, so she turned her back to the greenhouse. At that moment, she heard Raul's voice. He was talking to the Marchioness Barca, listing Inés's many supposed accomplishments. She approached them and greeted the Marchioness Barca with a nod. Then she announced she had prepared simple gifts to show her gratitude to the ladies and asked if she could kindly help her summon the wives for a tour of the residence. When the tour reached the library, the women were in awe of the beautiful landscape seen from the window. However, Inés's attention turned to a drunk woman standing by the window. Whatever was in her glass was certainly not wine. She quickly ran to Mrs. Salvatore and secured her. Inés helped the woman sit on the sofa and decided to call Raul to help her. However, she turned her gaze to Madame Salvatore when she said that this beautiful house did not belong to Lieutenant Escalante. Inés had no idea what Madame Salvatore was talking about. All she cared about was saving her new rug in case Madame Salvatore vomited from drinking so much. The woman insisted she wasn't drunk. On the contrary, she said the only drunk here is her husband. He is always out of his mind, even without alcohol. She was always the one who needed to drink because one cannot live with a madman unless one stays drunk to match his state of mind. Inés nodded. She knew that more than anyone. She also went through years of addiction during which she stayed intoxicated from dawn to dusk, determined to live a life opposite to her previous one. She had never taken a sip of alcohol in this life. Instead, she developed a new habit of constantly drinking a type of liquid, though only water or juice. Perhaps she only managed to defend herself from her addiction because of this habit holding, a glass of water and deceiving herself into thinking it was no different from alcohol. Madame Salvatore continued to lament. Although she has remarried, there is a reason her husband continues ruining their marriages. He makes them lose everything. At this rate, she will die or end up killing that man. Inés reminded her that if she divorces her husband, neither of them will have to die. However, Madame Salvatore screamed that divorce is for people like him, not for her. But of course, how could someone like Inés understand that? She is the esteemed daughter of Duke Valestena and will soon be Duchess Escalante. Inés retorted inwardly that she knows more than she can imagine. After all, she had already attempted murder and in the end had killed herself in a fit of rage. At that moment, Carcel entered through the door, looking for Inés. He seemed to have arrived at the perfect moment, and Inés took the opportunity to ask him to accompany Madame Salvatore to her husband. But Lieutenant Salvatore was in the same state as her. He then knelt, treated Madame Salvatore with the utmost respect, and asked permission before touching her to take her to the carriage. While he treated her as courteously as he would treat any lady of noble blood, the woman in his arms continued to curse her husband like a sailor, and Inés couldn't help but laugh at the scene. Suddenly, Madame Salvatore stumbled and tried to grab onto Carcel's arms. However, one of Carcel's hands bound her wrists like handcuffs and the other firmly grabbed her shoulder and supported her whole body. Carcel had every excuse to touch Madame Salvatore, but he didn't do it. While Inés almost wished he hadn't resolved the situation so precisely and politely, out of pure admiration, she said he is really skilled at this. But Carcel didn't understand her words and asked what she meant. She replied that it is literally what she just said. He is good at anything that has to do with women. It's not something abnormal for him. Honestly, she even bets he's enjoying this since Mrs. Salvatore is quite pretty. Clearly irritated, Carcel threw Madame Salvatore over his shoulder like a sack of potatoes and left the reception room, ignoring Inés's glances. The other ladies peeking from the door ran into the reception room as soon as Carcel left, with the woman on his shoulder. They started chattering so fast that Inés could barely keep up with who was saying what. After Carcel took the woman to the carriage, he returned to the reception room and found Inés peeking through the window. She only noticed him when he said that she isn't pretty, as she didn't understand what he said out of nowhere. Carcel explained clearly that he didn't find Lieutenant Salvatore's wife the least bit pretty. What he is trying to say is that he has no reason to be satisfied when a drunk woman throws herself at him. Of course, she isn't pretty, but whether she is pretty or not doesn't matter. In fact, he hasn't seen any woman more beautiful than Inés today. He hasn't seen any, not just today, but every day. Inés remained in silence, listening to Cárcel say that if she thinks her husband likes having drunk women falling over him right in front of her, then she is seriously mistaken. Cárcel's face lost all color when he heard Inés ask if perhaps the opportunity to be with her would be more attractive if she weren't here, just as happened many months ago. Cárcel made it clear that he doesn't need her or any other woman. Even if they threw themselves at him, he would reject them. Inés replied ironically to keep refusing then, while touching his face with her hand. Cárcel grabbed her hand and bit it, and she screamed in pain. They looked like two children fighting, him grumbling that she doesn't even deserve to feel pain, and her retorting that he doesn't have the right to feel offended. Cárcel agreed with what she said. His past indiscretions caused great insult to her. Ian insisted that she never felt insulted, but he wasn't listening and continued saying that he should have apologized sooner. He lived a shameful life and brought shame to her as well. He practically looked ready to jump off a cliff to prove his genuine contrition. But Inés silenced him before he claimed to do something more extreme. Because he needs to stay alive. In order for him to have an affair, she needs him to cheat so that she can manage to divorce him without any problem. She looked up and tilted his face down to face her. She only expects one thing from him, that he remains this handsome for the rest of his days. Inés seemed so sincere in saying this that Cárcel asked if she would throw him away if he became ugly. She replied that of course not, because he knows she will never abandon him first. A few minutes later, Cárcel was standing before the mirror smiling like an idiot. Only a day ago, his wife decided that he couldn't be an idiot, but he was proving her wrong now. His mind was too busy with Inés's voice saying that she will never leave him, as direct as always. All she said was that she wouldn't leave him if he became less attractive than now. But Cárcel's brain rewrote the narrative to interpret her words as a promise that she would never leave him. For a man like Cárcel, a 1% decrease in attractiveness would still mean he would still be the most handsome man in Ortega and potentially the entire world. Suddenly, Raúl knocked on the ajar door and warned that Lieutenant Salvatore sent a messenger. Apparently, he left something behind but couldn't locate it at the residence. Cárcel merely instructed that Raúl give the messenger anything so he would leave, which left Raúl confused, because he would be giving him something that wasn't his. Then Cárcel explained that just sending something for free to Lieutenant Salvatore is easier than explaining the truth to a drunk, and so the messenger doesn't get beaten. Raúl didn't know how to respond. Even if Cárcel didn't care much, the truth was that Lieutenant Salvatore was stealing inadvertently. Perhaps he doesn't care enough or cares too much about the messenger. Raúl didn't insist much on the matter and changed the subject. He said he still hadn't told Lady Inés about the fact that he was spying on her. Meanwhile, Inés observed the majestic sunset on the horizon, together with all the other ladies. The Marquesa Esparza, who was beside Inés, commented that she finally understood the reason. It was because Lieutenant Escalante clearly wanted to show his wife this view. Before Inés could process this information, Madame Acevedo entered the conversation, saying that he must have desired to live in such a beautiful place with his lovely wife. But Inés still wasn't understanding. So Madame Acevedo told her that Lieutenant Escalante bought this house well before their wedding. He had a much larger house closer to the Navy headquarters. Inés couldn't understand why Cárcel would move to a smaller house farther from his workplace. Of course, this place is charming, cute, and cozy, and at this time of day, it has a view that is breathtaking. But for Inés, there was no way he did this just for her. There's no way Cárcel Escalante had done something so silly and naive. Back in the room, Raúl said he just wanted him to know that now he knows his secret, and if Inés finds out, she will be very furious. She will consider it an insult. Raúl didn't expect Cárcel to be so calm. He had never seen him so composed and cold in front of Inés. Cárcel had been so tame and easy to read, but now Raúl doesn't know what he's thinking. Suddenly, Cárcel said that he is not spying on Inés, but rather on Raúl. His gaze landed on Cárcel in shock, and he asked if he is jealous of him. When Cárcel heard the silly sigh, he finally admitted for the first time that yes, he was jealous. Only jealousy could explain his actions and why he fell so low as to have a boy like Raúl discovering his secret. Wanting to put an end to this story, Cárcel asked directly if Raúl loves Inés. A sudden blush exploded on Raúl's face. Although his whole face and the tips of his ears were rosy, he didn't seem shy or embarrassed. Cárcel calmly observed Raúl's reaction, trying to discern what Raúl really was, but didn't seem too curious about the answer. Raúl gave a sigh and asked please not to degrade his affection for her with an inferior word like love. His loyalty to her is more devoted than that. Regardless, He will refrain from mentioning this to Lady Inés in the future because he doesn't want to hurt her even in the smallest possible ways. Carcel didn't care about Raoul's choice of words. He believed he couldn't hurt Inés's feelings even if he tried. Before leaving, Raoul bowed deeply, which didn't come from his usual etiquette, but a sincere request came from his mouth. He implored that Carcel not hurt Lady Inés. He observed the attitude of Inés's loyal servant for a moment before he straightened up and left the room. Although Raoul had promised not to tell Inés in the future, he never specified the exact time frame. So he decided the future would start after this conversation with Inés. He knows it is not a pleasant subject, but this could be a good opportunity for Inés, as his surveillance is proof of his interest in his lady. As unpleasant as it may be, Raoul believes that Carcel is the best partner for Inés. She is the only lady of the house Valestena, so she deserves only the best of the best. After all, family, reputation, and appearance are all of the highest level. And as soon as the crown prince ascends the throne, the lieutenant will become his closest confidant, and he won't be a soldier forever. So Inés won't have to keep playing housewife in this small cabin for long. Inés interrupted him before he could continue and said suddenly that this is how everyone lives. People betray their wives, their husbands, their children, and even themselves. Everyone does it, and Carcel is not the only one lying to her. Raoul responded confidently that she didn't betray him when she was engaged, unlike Carcel, who had indecent behavior. But Inés responded that she wasn't in her right mind at that time. Whenever Inés mentioned those dark days, Raoul's face fell with dread. After a moment of silence, he said that she was simply sick for a few years. Inés emphasized that she is fine now and quickly changed the subject. She had been thinking about what Raoul said, that this could be her chance, so she asked that Raoul spy on Carcel as well. In fact, Inés decided to use this opportunity for her own, even if it was different from Raoul's intentions. Several years could pass in the blink of an eye. Now that Carcel started spying on her first, she had the perfect excuse to start her own intelligence mission. After spying on Cárcel Escalante for the last 10 days, even going so far as to infiltrate the Navy headquarters, Raoul found no surprising revelations. All he managed to do was confirm that Carcel's life was exactly as it appeared from the outside. It was from the house to the barracks, and from the barracks to the house. He lived the predictably monotonous lifestyle of a diligent Navy officer. Inés lived a more exciting life, even when she rarely left the house and took a nap all day. Some would consider Carcel's life a natural result of being in the Navy, but Castella was full of entertainment for officers like gambling houses, pubs, men's clubs, and the red light district. Inés discovered that most officers practically live in the betting houses and bars. Only a rare few live like Cárcel. These few live an ethically boring lifestyle consisting of physical exercises and training. Although Cárcel might have a disgusting past, she believed he was a better type of man. She knew he had a good heart. Knowing this fact sometimes stabbed her with guilt. And although she was sure that Cárcel was not the lowest of the low, she could still imagine Cárcel seducing another woman. She can even imagine them together in bed. In fact, he probably didn't need to try very hard to flirt with women. His face would do all the flirting for him. And because he is naturally good, Inés doubts that he would even attempt a woman's life. She is sure he is just containing himself for now. He would continue to do this as long as she remained in Castella, or as long as he remained strangely fascinated with their marriage. Cárcel seemed to have lost a bit of his sanity when he married her. She pondered that this was his coping mechanism to deal with the reality of a marriage he didn't want. So for now, she didn't need to rush anything because she is sure he will return to his normal soon. After a moment of reflection, Inés asked Raoul to continue the report on First Lieutenant Mose, and he began to tell what he discovered. Although spying on Cárcel hadn't yielded fruits, Raoul discovered countless secrets about people around Cárcel. It could be said that his reports could be considered a natural part of a background check on Cárcel. But Inés had ulterior motives. She knew how powerful secrets can be. Even though kindness might seem to motivate people on the surface, she knew that fear was the true motivator, so she would use all this information in her favor at the right moment. 2 weeks later, in the hunting fields on the outskirts of the naval port, Inés and the other ladies were not hunting there but eating cookies on the grass. Madame Acevedo's eyes sparkled with anticipation upon hearing a shot, and she asked Inés if she thinks it was Lieutenant Escalante. Certain that the shot missed, Inés responded that it's better to pray that not. Let's pray that not was what her brother Luciano said when she was 14 or 15 years old. He taught her that she needs to listen for the sounds of a contained explosion of branches breaking, because those sounds will give her the answer. This happened in her first life before she married Oscar at 16, and her life collapsed completely. She used to hunt mainly with her brother. All her best memories of those innocent days were with Luciano. He was Inés's only family. Unfortunately, any happy memory of Luciano soured when he brutally killed Emiliano and when he promised her father that he would kill her baby. The fresh forest air took Inés back to when she was only 14 or 15 years old, wandering through the forest with the characters of her past. If anyone asked her now, the smallest details of her memories could escape her mouth, but none of these people existed except in her memories. Remembering a past that never occurred was exhausting and not much different from psychosis. Perhaps all of this is just a disease, thought Inés, but no one could argue on behalf of her sanity anyway. And perhaps she is even lucky to be here instead of tied up in an asylum. She observed Cárcel turn to face her and she said to herself positive affirmations that it's okay. Her life now is not bad and her luck hasn't been miserable so far. And she relished having an objective in her life. Between the tall, straight trees, Inés could see the rest of the men. She evaluated each one in her head, a piece of trash, another piece of absolute trash, and a gambling addict. And there was Cárcel, who was the only one who managed to hunt anything so far. Inés couldn't stop her last thought from escaping her lips and said aloud, "What is wrong with him?" Madame Acevedo asked what she said, and Inés responded with a fake smile on her face that she was thinking about how proud she is of him. In reality, Inés was frustrated because she couldn't understand why Cárcel kept smiling like an idiot whenever their gazes met. Then Cárcel walked over to Inés, smiling at her with pride, and unlike the other men, his confident walk indicated that he had completed today's task. She still wondered what was wrong with him today. When he approached and hugged Inés, she wanted to push him away as she would at home, but contained the urge because she was in front of other people. He kissed her on the corner of her forehead and asked if she got bored while waiting. She replied no, especially because she was with the other ladies. Madame Acevedo questioned why she would be bored because out of the 8 decent shooters, only her husband is an excellent marksman. So she must have been fascinated. Other ladies also agreed and added that she struggled to hide her pride and joy. They also commented that this is the first time his wife accompanies him on a hunt. This conversation made Inés so confused that she wondered if that's why he kept shooting all the birds despite the disdainful looks from his fellow officers. Cárcel suddenly turned to Inés and broke into a boyish smile and asked if she really was proud of him. She didn't respond, but Inés felt her heart beat faster the instant she saw the childish joy on Cárcel's face. After the hunt, Cárcel and Inés were returning home in their carriage. Inés observed Cárcel looking at the window. He still kept a smile on his face. He really seemed happy after hearing what the ladies said. He pulled away from the window to look at Inés when she asked if they should go to the great chapel to attend the week's mass, as the other ladies suggested. Cárcel responded that he doesn't mind either way, but it would be more convenient to hold a family mass. However, Inés commented that it is convenient but not very appropriate, and Cárcel's superiors won't like it. Family mass is a simple format of mass in which the priest is called to visit the houses instead of the members having to go visit the chapel. Normal masses are considered very important in the empire, so this practice is not very common. Inés commented that she heard today that Cárcel used to attend masses at the great chapel until she arrived, and the only reason she opted for family masses instead of going to a chapel in Mendoza was because she found it an uncomfortable social event. But now that they are married, Inés doesn't want others to criticize him because of her. In truth, she had no idea that masses were the main social event in Castella. She missed good opportunities to expose Cárcel to other women. She was worried about parties and renovations while the absolute gold mine was right under her nose. Alarmed by Inés's intentions, Cárcel refused and said that she doesn't need to do that for him. But Inés kept insisting. So he asked when she started caring so much about him like that. She replied that she always cared about him. She cares, and he knows it, which made Cárcel fall silent for a moment, completely speechless. Suddenly, he asked her to stop teasing him like that. Due to the rules Inés had set, they could only do it once a day. So he warned that she can't go around saying these things to make him get a hard banana. Inés was shocked. She didn't understand how he gets excited so easily, nor what excites him so much. Cárcel stood up from his seat and sat beside Inés. He held one of Inés's hands with one of his hands and the other pulled her waist closer to him. His strong fingers pressed the soft skin on the inside of her wrist while he said that it's her fault for making him so excited. After all, it's not a hobby of his to get like this out of nowhere. She closed her eyes to his hypocrisy and said expressionlessly to take his hands off her and not waste his chance of the day in a place like this. However, Cárcel was already smelling her nape deeply. He commented that he could feel her fragrance stronger here, and she responded that of course, since she put on perfume. Cárcel crossed the path from Inés's nape to her collarbone and then to her slightly exposed cleavage and said that in truth, the fragrance of her perfume is stronger here in her breasts. Inez looked at him. He was making that smoldering look again and was also saying stupid things. But strangely, she didn't feel like punching him right now. While Cárcel continued to tease her, Inez thought that if it continues at this rate, she isn't sure if an opportunity will appear at the chapel as well. The moment Inez entered the great chapel, she immediately spotted a blonde girl at first sight. And furthermore, the blonde beauty had her attention fixed on Cárcel with her radiant eyes. At that moment, an opportunity arose. An opportunity had finally appeared. She was finally blessed with the chance to manage to pair Cárcel with another woman. At her 6 years of age, Inés was tormented by the crown prince who tirelessly asked her to marry him. She always refused his request in the most polite way possible. Even so, he didn't accept it, because having a marriage with him would be more advantageous than marrying someone like Cárcel, who has only a pretty face and who would probably only bring problems with betrayals. Inez knew that Oscar would be much worse. He wouldn't just bring her problems with women, but with men as well. And as usual, Oscar always left angry and promising that he won't give up. But on this specific day, a boy observed, and when he turned to ask Inez what had happened, he shuddered upon meeting her eyes. This boy was 5 years older than Inez. His name was Enrique Osorno, and he was the only grandson of Duke Osorno. Inez knew that he would grow up as an exceptionally healthy young man who loves his wife. In short, he doesn't get sick or fall into any kind of trouble, and he is the last person a woman would expect to divorce in the empire. The most successful women are either divorced or the husband died or disappeared. They are the women who are not tied to anything or anyone and who can live an independent life. That is the only way to be completely free. For this reason, Inez's only objective is to get divorced. Of course, it would be great if she didn't have to marry, but being born as a daughter of House Valistena, that doesn't even become an option. She would bring shame to her parents, her family, and furthermore would be thrown to the lowest position of high society, which would be painful even for her. Not to mention that single women are not even permitted to make decisions about their own assets. Even at an advanced age, a woman of Ortega must marry even before being treated as an adult, although she is treated only as someone's wife. What she needs is not a mediocre husband like Enrique Osorno, but a man worth expelling from her life legally someday. To have the title and assets recognized, an abundant pension, and the right to be independent. No matter how stupid a man is, he can have all that upon turning 17. But the woman must go through the difficulties of marriage, divorce, and even mourning to have the same things. But at this point, this is Inez's only option. She doesn't need someone who is handsome. In fact, she prefers a man who dies shortly after she gives birth to her son. But she doesn't plan to sacrifice anyone for that. She needs a man who will leave on his own someday. A man with a face so perfect that he will be coveted by all women. At that moment, the face of Cárcel arose in her mind. Although Inés doesn't understand the reason he never married a woman in her previous lives. She knew that he didn't carry venereal diseases like Oscar since the Crown Prince had investigated him and found no greater fault than Cárcel being a womanizer. Inés gradually decided that he would be the best option. A man with a face so beautiful that his slightest effort to seduce would make any woman open her legs for him. That day, Inés ran to her father and said that she finally made up her mind. She decided to marry the most beautiful man in the world. Inés spoke with a girl's voice full of dreams and hopes, the exact opposite of her eyes, which looked at Cárcel without emotion, because she needed someone who would enable her an easy divorce. She needed Cárcel, the greatest of womanizers. Back to the present, Inés observed the woman in front of her. She had never seen such a beautiful blonde before, and she is even more beautiful up close. As soon as they entered the chapel, Cárcel kept busy avoiding other women like an idiot. But Inés kept her eyes on her, which proved worthwhile because she is someone he cannot avoid or ignore like the other women, since she is the granddaughter of a Navy admiral. Furthermore, the girl looks at Inés with indifference, which is perfect for Inés since this proves that this beautiful blonde likes Cárcel so much that she keeps glaring at his wife with that expression. Cárcel looked awkwardly at Inés's face, but she didn't seem upset by the way Miss Maria was treating her. She even omitted Inés's title to be rude and belittle her. However, contrary to his expectations that Inés might be angry, she was actually all excited. Miss Maria commented that she didn't have the opportunity to appear at the wedding banquet, so she wanted to congratulate Cárcel today in person. After all, she was quite curious to see the woman who managed to meet his standards, but she supposes it didn't matter much what he wanted, since the marriage was arranged by their families. In her contradictory phrases, Inés saw how Maria distorted her words, and yet tried to appear elegant. Inés really started to like her. If she could have it her way, she would have arranged a meeting for Maria and Cárcel immediately, but instead, she decided to irritate Maria even more. She noticed how Maria just now called her the wife of an Escalante instead of specifying Cárcel. So she said that while it's true that she is Cárcel Escalante's wife, it's more appropriate to say that Cárcel Escalante is her husband, since the choice was in fact Inés's. She explicitly mentioned Cárcel's name and even arrogantly insinuated that she had the power to possess him and not the other way around. Maria's eyes were full of conflicting emotions, disgust toward Inés and sympathy for Cárcel. From Maria's point of view, the object of her unrequited love married an inadequate wife due to a unilateral engagement, and now the wife they are at was acting in an arrogant and unpleasant way. Inés was so entertained by Maria's cute expression that she forgot about Cárcel, who commented that, unfortunately, they need to say goodbye now. Maria quickly said she has something to discuss with him for a moment, but Cárcel interrupted her in mid-sentence to warn that he and Inés have a commitment. But Inés knew that the only commitment they had was to go back home. Maria looked at him with pleading eyes. She was obliquely blaming Inés for making Cárcel want to leave, and at the same time begging for a bit of Cárcel's time. She wanted to talk about her grandfather's illness, so Inés decided to let lovely Maria do what she wanted and said she can take Cárcel because he is all yours for today. But later, Cárcel was at Admiral Noriega's residence. He was bedridden in bed and asked Cárcel if Maria forced him to come here. He also commented that he doesn't need to be so complacent just because she likes him. She has to learn to accept reality. Cárcel responded that he had no choice because Maria mentioned the Admiral's illness in front of his wife. Cárcel was sure that it was obvious to Inés that Maria was after him and was only giving mere little excuses. But even so, she still made him come here alone with her. The Admiral asked if his granddaughter did something to offend Escalante's wife, because even if she is his granddaughter, she is still immature and her ambitions are too great. Of course, the Admiral himself would like to have Cárcel as part of the family too, but it's not normal for her to be obsessed with him for all these years. And stopping to think, he can't understand why Cárcel delayed this marriage so much. He commented that it was Inés who married someone below her, not the other way around. Cárcel clearly didn't know what to respond, so the Admiral continued speaking. He doesn't know how these strange rumors arose about such a beautiful woman. But she seemed very calm and lucid, and her eyes were particularly beautiful because her eyes are those of someone who knows what they are doing. He warned that Cárcel should have married much sooner, because he would never find another woman like that if the marriage had broken. But it's good that everything worked out in the end. He is happy to see Cárcel settling down because even the great Cárcel Escalante becomes a man like any other when he is in love. Cárcel didn't respond. He was trying to process what the Admiral had said. He leaned in and responded that he is enjoying his marriage more than he expected, but he is far from being in love, and that he doesn't know for what reasons Mr. Noriega has to say that. He responded that there are many reasons and all of them are written right on your idiot face. And before Cárcel left, he advised Cárcel that he must not ruin this marriage for his own good. When Cárcel left the mansion, he thought about Admiral Noriega's advice. He always trusted his advice, just as Noriega trusted Cárcel's grandfather, Admiral Calderón. He decided that the Admiral was right. He doesn't need to waste his time with jealousy over Inés. He needs to enjoy this marriage somehow. In a brief moment of clarity, he looked around and noticed a familiar figure disappear from his sight across the street. When Cárcel left to visit Admiral Noriega, Inés met with Raúl and ordered him to finally do some real spying. He asked if he didn't go to visit the Admiral. Inés agreed. But one never knows what can happen on the carriage ride, and she was hopeful. She placed all her faith in Maria. She believed that it would finally be the beginning of a romance between Cárcel and Maria. Smiling at the possibility of betrayal, she quickly cut him off, making it clear that it didn't matter. Then she ordered him to do as she commanded and warned that she would now go for a walk alone with Madame Acevedo. Back to the present, Cárcel was sure he spotted Raúl, but he should be serving his wife at home. So he began to wonder what this wretch was doing here. When Cárcel finally reached where he had seen his servant, Raúl had already disappeared without a trace. He was surprised by Raúl's unexpected speed and agility, but Cárcel still couldn't understand the situation. It could be speculation, but Cárcel thought that following him was clearly something Raúl would do because of his exaggerated loyalty. It was something he might be doing without Inés knowing. He preferred Inés to stay by his side rather than just keep laughing. If she got jealous, suspicious, or irritated, Cárcel got excited just thinking about it. But it was something impossible coming from Inés. Cárcel began to walk quickly toward the headquarters while Raúl still watched, and then decided it was time to return to the Escalante residence. Meanwhile, Madame Acevedo was looking for Inés. She had asked Inés to wait while she went after a jeweler, but the jeweler took the carriage and disappeared, and now she didn't know where Lady Escalante had gone. In a jewelry store in El Tabel, the jeweler brought a pendant on a velvet cushion, a diamond-shaped pendant with delicate gold carvings, and showed it to Inés, informing her that this was the pendant she was looking at through the window. She approached the jewelry with a hesitant hand and asked if this was the Olivini pendant. He replied yes and praised her for having good eyes. Most people thought it was a brooch, but she knew it was a pendant. Inés took the jewelry and turned the pendant over. She knew the double crosses and the letters engraved on the back very well. Her fingers traced the initials below the crosses. An acronym, VE, was engraved on the brooch, meaning Valinda Oliveras. It was her grandmother's maiden name. Her grandmother gave her the necklace that Inés later gave to Emiliano on the first night she slept with him. Emiliano's eyes widened upon seeing the Olivini necklace in her hands. He asked if she was giving him that, but said he couldn't accept such a thing that was on Inés's body, as it would be too greedy on his part. Inés replied that he was handsome and had surprising strength, but if he spoke a little less, he would be perfect. When she suddenly noticed Emiliano crying and asked why, he replied that she was like a dream, so he couldn't believe what was happening. Curiously, that moment seemed like a dream to Inés too, as everything was being different from what she was used to. She had never heard that before. It wasn't like the things she heard from Oscar in her past life. That night, she felt that true love would be possible with a commoner, and she believed she could live an authentic life if she had nothing. She naively imagined she could take advantage of this innocent man. She naively thought she had nothing left to lose. Inés told Emiliano that she wasn't handing over this necklace because she was trying to silence him. No one would believe him even if he went around telling everyone. She was giving him this necklace because it symbolized her heart. Inés was blushing and was very shy, but she found words to say that she liked Emiliano, for she knew he was the only man in the world who accepted her innocent trust. That was why she was willing to hand over her heart to him. He finally accepted the necklace and said it reminded him of Inés's eyes. From then on, Emiliano treated the necklace like the Holy Grail. He was a sensitive man and cared deeply for Inés's first gift, as it was a memory of their first night together. However, both were inexperienced and poor. She was 16 and he was 18. They wandered the country miserably poor for 4 years and sold everything they owned. The delicate gold chain of the Olivini necklace was no exception. Emiliano had little desire for material things, but he lamented this loss when they sold the gold chain and appreciated the remaining pendant even more. Finally, they resorted to selling the pendant in El Tabel a few days before Emiliano's death. By that point, they had already sold everything else, and the pendant was their only valuable asset. When he finally sold it, he cried for the loss. He said he had put her through so much that he ruined everything. That was her first gift to him. It was her heart, and she said she liked him regardless of his humble origin. But in the end, she was suffering because of him. Emiliano's death, which Inés witnessed, was more painful than that day. After checking if Emiliano had stopped breathing, Luciano warned that Inés's companion was dead. She replied that he was not her companion, he was her husband, for they made their marriage vows before God. He looked at her with a look Inés had never seen before in Luciano, and stated that she had then made a false oath before God. After returning home, she turned everything upside down to find her grandmother's necklace. She finally held the real necklace in her hand. This was the real necklace. The other must be a cheap trick invented by someone malicious enough to play with her fate. Emiliano would continue to be a happy and ignorant painter and live his life in peace without ever meeting her. Therefore, she should be relieved. But the shopkeeper's words echoed in her ears. He said that the owner of this necklace left this item here about 3 years ago, and Emiliano had died 3 years ago. She had spent all of her third life without looking at this necklace, but now she felt feelings dominate her. Her head was spinning again. Her baby's crying echoed in her ears as if that terrible night had been yesterday. Inés buried her lips in the cold Olivini pendant and begged please that Emiliano not remember her, for she took her son's life and did not deserve to be forgiven. After having finished spying on Cárcel, Raúl returned to the residence to tell Inés about his spying. However, Inés suddenly appeared riding a horse. Raúl does not remember seeing Inés learn how to ride a horse, but that was not important now. What caught his attention most was the expression Inés had on her face. In El Tabel, Don Rosano, the manager of the jewelry store Inés visited earlier, observed the Olivini pendant and thought it was indeed a peculiar and strange piece of jewelry. He also thought that woman had black hair and green eyes. If that is the case, she should be the woman his client mentioned 3 years ago. Although his client had exaggerated her beauty a bit, Don Rosano had to admit he rarely encountered a woman of such rare beauty. Furthermore, she immediately recognized the pendant as part of a necklace, so he should send a letter to his client as he had promised 3 years ago. But he wondered what a man like that would have to do with a lady of noble lineage like her. Don Rosano remembered the image of the woman dressed in expensive fabric, even if she looked modest at first glance. He knew people rich enough to know the difference between replicas and authentic luxury items. Now that the improbable had happened, he had no desire to get involved in the case. He felt more reluctant when he remembered how the lady fled the shop in despair. If this business had something to do with infidelity, it was not a wise choice on the lady's part, and Don Rosano certainly wanted to avoid putting anyone at risk of intimidation. But that man had asked him to get in touch if a woman matching her description asked about the necklace. Now that she finally appeared, Don Rosano wonders what he should do. While he pondered, the shop door opened with a creak, and Inés appeared in front of him, the same woman Don Rosano had seen 2 hours ago. Inés asked him to sell that pendant to her. She wanted to know how much it cost and was willing to pay whatever he asked, as she didn't want to enter into an unnecessary negotiation. Don Rosano explained that this item already has an owner, and he had already paid a price for it. So Inés asked why he was displaying an item he cannot sell and belongs to someone else? Or was he trying to attract someone who might want it? Don Rosano began to sweat as if he were pleading, and Inés continued asking why someone who had already paid the price would not agree to sell. Then Don Rosano explained that his client said he could not come for a while but received a small storage fee, and as for the display window, the client wanted it to stay on display for some reason that only he knows. Then Inés ordered the jeweler to say who the owner of this pendant was. Her piercing gaze pierced Don Rosano. He had never felt intimidated by a young woman like that before. He was speechless. She looked nothing like the innocent beauty outside the display window before. She was practically a different woman. Come to think of it, he didn't even know which family she belonged to. Besides the expensive dress, the woman was not wearing any jewelry to signal her status. Perhaps her lineage was not as refined as it seemed. After a brief silence, Inés commented that since he does not intend to pass on the owner's name, she asked him to pass on this name to the owner, Valinda Olivares. Don Rosano struggled to maintain his composure. The Olivares family was one of the most prestigious among the 17 honored Grande families of Ortega. He then thought this woman must be a member of that family. He asked Inés that in case he gets a response from the owner of the pendant, should he contact the Olivares house. She replied that she is not an Olivares, she is an Escalante. Her husband is Lieutenant Escalante of the Castella Navy, and asked that he contact someone from the main residence and leave the message with her servant. Don Rosano doubted his hearing. He felt weak just hearing her last name. Just as the most prestigious families of El Tabel could not compare to the Olivares could not compare to the highly esteemed Escalantes. As the home of Ortega's largest naval base, the coast of Castella adored Admiral Calderón as a war hero who brought decades of peace to the nation. Thus, the Escalante name was sometimes even more revered than the emperor's name in this region. When he saw the woman turn around and leave, that woman now must be Inés Valestena. He was sure of it, for this was the woman his client was waiting to appear. Back at the Escalante residence, Raúl was walking back and forth when suddenly he heard the noise of the door opening, and turned quickly. He asked worriedly where Inés had gone. She ordered him to be quiet and not make any fuss, but he was startled to see Inés's countenance. He helped her sit in the chair while hearing Inés ask if he had any news of the artist Dom Joaquim. He replied that it was no time to worry about how the artists were doing, for she was barely able to breathe. Suddenly, she gasped and leaned over, hearing her difficult breathing. Raúl quickly searched his inner pocket and took out a small vial. Since she was attacked by an undiagnosable symptom, he always had one on hand for emergencies. However, Inés shouted that she wants to know where Emiliano is at this exact moment, which left Raúl surprised and confused at the same time. He then informed her that according to a letter he received from Dom Joaquim, Emiliano and Lourdes were sent to restore a torch that was being made in Bibal Cathedral, so he must be there at this exact moment. After informing her, with one hand steadying Inés, Raúl skillfully opened the vial with the other hand and the medicine dripped from the vial onto her lips. Even while swallowing the liquid, Inés struggled to breathe. Inés had created a plan to guide Emiliano toward a happier life, and the complexities of her plan sent him to a place far away from her. Although Inés had asked the shopkeeper to contact the owner of the necklace, she knew the news would not reach Emiliano, since Emiliano's talent had already caught the archbishop's attention. He would be chained to Bilbao for a few years. Emiliano asked the shopkeeper to put the Olivini pendant on display. He did this 3 years ago when he thought he would live the rest of his life in oligarchy. The same year he sold the necklace, and the same year he died in her life before the regression. No, Inés clenched her fist, trying to get it out of her head. There was no way it was Emiliano. There was no way something so terrible was possible, or God was definitely playing with her. The only thing in common between Inés's first and second lives was that in both, she killed herself. No matter how much she thought about it, the only reason she returned, both in a 16-year-old body the first time and a 6-year-old body the second, is because she is being punished by God. Suddenly, Raoul's worried voice echoed in her ears. She then ordered Raoul to give her some privacy. He thought about giving an answer to stay, but when he heard a please from Inés, he withdrew from the room. Her head felt weak. She could not maintain a clear thought in the midst of the slippery grip on reality. Inés found solace in the real thing she held in her hand. She knew she had the necklace in its original, uninterrupted form. When Inés was 7 years old, she inherited this necklace again, shortly before Valinda's death. Her grandmother died in the same year as in previous lives. Since then, nothing significant happened, so this necklace was always hers. The only evidence of the truth was in her hand. Finding Emiliano again would be a simple task, but at the same time, it was something she would never dare to do. Although Inés wanted to confirm her suspicions, she did not want to discover the truth in any way. She only wanted to live and die in a world different from her past lives. Suddenly, Inés's body collapsed. She could not breathe when her head hit the floor. Cárcel had just entered the room, and through her weak vision, Inés saw Cárcel's face, which looked shocked, thinking she had never seen him that way before. And finally, she fainted. No one was looking after Inés when she fainted, so the staff whispered about the terrible things that could have happened to her if Cárcel had not discovered her in time. The maid Rhonda was one of those people who commented on what could have happened to Lady Escalante if Cárcel had not appeared. Although she spoke softly, her words resonated in the silent room. She was echoing words others had already said many times. What if he hadn't reached Madame Inés in time? Whenever someone mentioned this, Cárcel's face turned paler instead of appearing relieved or satisfied with his timely intrusion. His imagination provided the details of the terrible scenario and what could have happened if he hadn't entered the room at the right time. Until now, everything had been chaotic. Until now, except for Raoul. Alfonso swallowed his words and looked at Raoul as someone who could provide the most detailed testimony about Inés's sudden symptoms. Raoul answered the doctor's occasional questions in the midst of all the confusion and consternation. Only Raoul seemed calm, as if he had a contingency plan from the beginning. When he admitted he had seen Inés hyperventilate before the collapse, Cárcel almost strangled him, but he did not seem disturbed. Raoul explained that he had treated the initial symptoms with his emergency medication and left the room because Inés did not want him around. From Alfonso's point of view, Raoul's loyalty was almost akin to religious devotion. No one in the residence would be surprised if Raoul had fainted beside Inés. His devotion to Inés was so intense. However, Raoul acted strangely composed and practiced, suggesting that this fainting was not the first of its kind. The case with the Acevedos was also strange. Apparently, an empty carriage was standing at the Acevedo mansion, and Madame Acevedo had not yet returned home after going with Inés. The story might have been easier to understand if Inés had taken a carriage when she left home the second time. However, she had taken one of Cárcel's horses from the stable so fast that no one could stop her. Even Raoul, who was returning to the residence, was in shock, for no one had the slightest idea until now that she knew how to ride, not even him. Alfonso remembered Raoul looking fascinated while watching Inés disappear from his sight. Raoul had said he had no idea she knew how to ride a horse. Sometimes he feels he doesn't know her. Sometimes he feels Madame Inés is from a completely different world, as if she were only living half in this world. Alfonso stepped out of his memories and cast his gaze toward Inés. He concluded that Raoul could only remain calm because he was used to this situation. Perhaps this strange series of events, Inés's hurried departure from the house, her sudden fainting, and more, had already occurred in the past. So I need to send someone to Valestina, Alfonso thought. Cárcel went to a corner of the window with the Navy medical officer and asked if he had already determined the exact cause. He replied that what he heard from others and from Raoul was not something that determined anything precisely. He informed that apparently the symptoms were not severe or frequent, so he would be able to determine the causes for certain later. What he could say now is that Lady Escalante seemed to be very tired. He explained that the tiredness must have been very excessive. Perhaps she suffered a shock while in her state of fatigue, and perhaps her lungs or her heart had always been weak. Or perhaps both. Cárcel then wondered if the reason she almost died was because her body was weak and had been overloaded. The doctor replied that could be a cause, but in any case, the worst had passed for now, and added that he gave her sleeping medicine so she would not wake up until tomorrow morning. After the doctor withdrew, Cárcel thought about the possibility of contacting the most renowned doctor in the Empire. However, Raoul appeared before him and said that no doctor in the world would be able to correctly diagnose what Lady Inés has. He confirmed that the treatment used by the Navy doctor was not wrong. It really was a necessary treatment. and added that he was deeply moved when he ran to get the doctor and came back. He seemed proud of Cárcel for passing Inés's good husband test, but Cárcel did not feel the same pride, and instead narrowed his eyes and said he knows it was not he who saved Inés, but the medicine Raúl gave her. Raúl tried to argue that if the lieutenant hadn't entered the room, but Cárcel quickly cut him off and said that from the beginning what helped was that medicine. Then he asked, "Since when does she need this medicine?" Raúl hesitated to speak, and after a brief moment of silence, he said that medicine is not something she takes regularly. It is only in cases of emergency. And the first time was when she was 16. Cárcel tried to recall those memories. When he was 16, he almost never saw Inés. She did not write any scary letters or send endless gifts as she used to. She also stopped accepting his occasional courtesy visits and rejected any invitation to social events with Cárcel, unless her aunt, the Empress, demanded her presence. She stopped spending time with him completely. Of course, she was always awkward, demanding, rude, temperamental, even when she claimed to be in love with him as a child or gradually expressed less affection during her adolescence. He knew her antisocial disposition remained unchanged, but that time seemed different. Something seemed strange about her. Although he never felt close to her in the first place, he felt even further from her that year. Cárcel remembered feeling a bit defeated, scared, and even betrayed while returning from the Valestena mansion when he was 15. That was roughly when Cárcel finally started to become interested in marrying Inés. Despite what the rest of the world said, he felt that their life together might not be so bad. He arrogantly believed that he made her feel at ease, therefore he could make her laugh occasionally. Naive as he was, he no longer feared making eternal vows at the altar. His pride deceived him into thinking that even if he couldn't return her feelings, he could accept a little of her love hidden under her indifferent resentment. But Cárcel felt as if the 16-year-old Inés were slipping from his grasp just when he was ready to take a step forward. He clearly remembered the moment when any trace of her affection disappeared. Whenever she looked at him with disgust, his adolescent pride ached. Her eyes were not just empty, but became rigid, as if she intended to exclude him completely. When he was 15 or 16, he did all these silly things to get her attention, like swallowing his pride and wandering around Paris to see her face. He remembered the countless times she rejected his visit, and he flirted thoughtlessly with other girls to spark indignation in Inés, hoping thus to gain her attention. He remembered how much he regretted sleeping with another girl for the first time. The next day, he refused to regret it or feel guilt for it, even while trembling with fear of having made an unrecoverable mistake. He wondered if Inés would be angry when she heard the news. He then worried if she would slap him, or perhaps she would lose her patience and try to strangle him. The young Cárcel's fear led to an unexpected conclusion, and he was shocked by his own nervousness. She is the one who liked him first, but she is also the one who doesn't put in the effort. She ignored him for years, and now she doesn't even want to see his face. Actually, she is the one who doesn't like him at all, and he is the only one who likes her. But it didn't matter. He thought he would never like someone like her anyway. He would never be that stupid. As soon as those words arose in his mind, he cringed at the thought and erased the memory. The following year, like a stray dog after a defeat, Cárcel enlisted in the military academy. Although becoming a military officer was his childhood dream, everyone thought he was trying to escape his arranged marriage. They were only partially right, but it didn't matter anyway. In fact, why should he care about a fiancée who had no interest in him? After all, they were forced to be engaged, and she never seemed to like him as much as she claimed. She must have chosen him because he was more handsome than the crown prince, and given her self-centered nature, she probably wouldn't like being part of the imperial court, and so she was forced to choose him. Cárcel pretended he never hoped for their future together or harbored any strange interest in her for a time. After he pretended nothing had happened, he finally felt free. So in the end, Inés was sick while he was sleeping with women and running away from her. She was sick all the time. She could barely breathe, eat, or sleep during all that time. 4 years passed like that, and she never left her bed a single day. Cárcel could no longer contain his feelings, knowing now that she was so sick during those years. But how could he have known if she hides herself like that? How was she so cruel in not telling him anything? In fact, he did not resent her, but rather himself. He knew he could not change the past, nor undo what had been done. He could not go back in time, force her door, or return to the naive fantasies of a 16-year-old boy. But perhaps he could have acted differently if he had known of her pain. If he had known why she ignored him, he would not have run away or given up on her. If he hadn't made that stupid mistake, or if he had been honest about his feelings and fallen in love with her. Cárcel mocked himself for acting as if he didn't love her already. The truth is that he was already in love with her. When he heard her breathing stop and thought she would never open her eyes again, His world collapsed and he could no longer deny his feelings. He couldn't stand thinking of those years when he had been so clueless. He could have made different choices even though he didn't have the slightest idea. He wanted to strangle himself right now. Love? How dare he love her if he was consumed by self-hatred? Instead of kissing her or confessing his love for her, he cried. Love didn't matter. All he needed was for Inés to open her eyes to see him, and that she could move her lips to call his name. Inés never liked children. The feeling of pregnancy was despicable. She would not love that child if it weren't Emiliano's son. In her dreams, she continued taking her baby's life. Perhaps it was inevitable. Every baby Inés ever had died. Almost all the babies in her womb died before even being born. But that was not her fault. They left her life as if her womb were never the right place for them. It wasn't that disgusting prince who took them from her. Except Luca. He was the most perfect thing in the world. He was the best thing she had ever done, the greatest achievement of her life. Suddenly her steps stopped when she realized the scenery had changed. A faint, childish laugh echoed in the distance. But the road was empty. The next thing she knew was that the apparition of a boy appeared in front of her. The boy appeared to be about 3 years old. She never met him, but instinctively knew he was Luca. A sudden realization hit her. She couldn't have him back, and didn't even deserve him. She had invented a child because her baby never lived long enough to turn 3 years old, to make herself happy with a mere invention of her imagination. She thought she must be losing her mind. This was pure illusion. When she fully registered what was happening, everything disappeared, and it was very eccentric. She had never had this kind of dream before. Although she didn't see anyone die this time, she felt worse than when she lost everyone in her dreams. Now she had to wake up with a deep sense of loss. Inés blinked her eyes open, and it was no longer dawn. The morning sunlight shone brightly. She felt herself enter into clarity. She felt recovered at dawn. And even better now. So she murmured the first thing that came to her mind, that she needs to speak with Lady Acevedo. Inés paused when her gaze landed on Cárcel sitting in a nearby chair. She could never guess how long he had been sitting there watching her sleep. He was sitting perfectly still. At first she thought he had woken up early as usual to go to work, but then she noticed his tired eyes and gasped at seeing that he hadn't slept at all. Cárcel asked that, after all this, is Madame Acevedo the first one she wants to see after waking up? She replied that she ended up leaving her alone in El Tabel. But Cárcel retorted that she is not a child for her to worry about leaving her alone. He asked what exactly happened. Inés thought of the decrepit sign of the jewelry store and quickly erased the image from her mind. The instant Cárcel approached and sat beside her on the bed, her memory dissipated upon seeing him. His normally tidy hair looked a bit disheveled. Cárcel might find her sudden silence strange, but she needed more time to shake off the dream and return to reality. He then reached out and slowly arranged the loose strands of hair on her forehead and lowered them over her ears. His tender touch reminded Inés of the hand that caressed her face at dawn, which made her feel like a little girl again. Instead of mocking how he treated her like a child, she leaned into the palm of his hand and let his hand gently hold her cheeks. In her previous life, when she was much younger, her brother Luciano and only Luciano made her feel loved and cared for. On the night her mother slapped her and dismissed her favorite nanny, Inés cried until she slept. Luciano sneaked into her space to whisper that she still has her big brother. Then he kissed her forehead and tucked her under the comforter. Years later, when she put a gun in her mouth before Oscar, the only face that passed through her mind was Luciano's. She decided to kill herself instead of killing Oscar to ensure that no one else in her family got hurt, and above all in the hope that Luciano would survive the ordeal, to live a long and full life. Inés kept her eyes fixed on Cárcel, thinking that he looked nothing like Luciano from that time. It was a strange feeling, but she felt relieved, as if she had finally come to the surface after struggling underwater for so long. The dream had ended and she had survived. That was all. The scary night had ended, and she didn't fall back into the nightmares of 3 years ago. Even when she thought of the Olivini necklace, she no longer felt strangled. She decided that later she would tell the shopkeeper to forget everything she had said. She would not accept this test of a monster playing with her. She would ignore it completely. Inés told Cárcel that she just ended up getting distracted for a moment while looking at some jewelry and got lost in El Tabel. She couldn't find the place where Madame Acevedo was, so she just took a carriage back. Cárcel replied that this is just like when a child gets lost from their parents. She should stay still when an adult tells her to stay still. Inés quickly reminded him that she is not a child. She wanted to get up, but Cárcel asked her to stay lying down and asked if she wants something to eat or drink. A glass of water, lemon juice, or apple juice. Inés's head was spinning over the flood of questions, and she unintentionally repeated, apple juice. So Carcel quickly stood up and shouted for the servants to prepare an apple juice now. Inés was surprised. She had never heard him seem more like a noble than now, and then said that he needs to go to work. Since she is already awake, he no longer needs to worry. However, she realized that he hadn't changed his clothes or lain down anywhere since last night because he was worried about her. So she began to explain that what happened was not a big deal. She doesn't know what he heard from Raoul, but this had happened a few times before, and the last time was a few years ago. It never happened recently. She had no idea that Raoul still kept those medicines with him, since it hadn't happened for years, for she had thought she was completely cured. Carcel commented that if Raoul hadn't been home yesterday, she would have died. He would have kicked him out of the house months ago if he could, and thank goodness he wasn't able to do that, for it is because of that that she is alive today. His next words sounded like a deep sigh. He said she could not breathe when she fainted, so how can this not be a big deal if she almost died? Inés was not sure how to respond. Her simple explanation didn't work, so she apologized for not having told Carcel before that she is defective, which left Carcel distraught with such a use of a word to describe herself. Inés straightened up in bed and said she thought this would never happen again, and it was her fault for not having told him before. If she had told him, he would not have been so surprised. Carcel clenched his fists. He asked if she was saying that he would have remained calm with her suffocating to death right in front of him if he had known about it in advance. Carcel murmured with sarcasm in his voice that it is no wonder she considers the inability to breathe a defect of hers. From now on, he won't even bother calling a doctor. He will just look at her faint and think it's nothing unusual. How convenient. Before he left the room, Inés quickly said that in the marriage market, this would be considered a flaw. The Valestinas hid this information from him, so she should apologize. Carcel ordered her not to mention the word flaw or defect once more. However, he stopped upon hearing Inés speak that at least next time he sees her father, he won't need to be attacked. And now he knows why her mother says she is a defective product. Inés could not complete the sentence because Carcel jumped on top of her. She fell back on the bed, and his looming figure cast shadows over her. Wondering if he wanted to touch her, she searched his eyes for a sign of lust, but she froze without blinking. A single tear fell from his right eye and landed on her face. Carcel asked how she could say those things. He had thought she was going to die, so how could she keep saying such cruel things? Inés asked if he was crying. As soon as the question left her lips, she realized how ridiculous it was, and she had seen his tears with her own eyes. Carcel seemed to be on the verge of breaking down. Perhaps he already had broken down. His broad shoulders shuddered for a second. He wished his tears would stop, but the tears continued overflowing without words. Inés observed for a long moment before asking why. She could not deny that he was crying, but still did not understand why.